They say power protects you. They're lying. I learned that truth the night my husband crowned his whore in front of 300 witnesses while I stood there in silken diamonds, choking on my own dignity. Queen Seraphina Vale. That title used to mean something, used to command armies. Now it's just expensive wallpaper covering the rot underneath. And here's what nobody tells you about betrayal at the top. It doesn't just break your heart. It shatters kingdoms. Stick with me until the end of this story because what happened next rewrote every rule about power, revenge, and survival. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is listening. You're going to need to remember this one. Seraphina's hands didn't shake during the lunar banquet. That came later, in private, where hands were allowed to tremble and queens were allowed to bleed. But there, under the crystal chandeliers with 500 candles burning gold against the vaulted ceiling, her fingers stayed steady around the stem of her wine glass. Steady even when Darius rose from his throne with that ugly smile she'd started noticing 6 months ago. The smile that didn't reach his eyes anymore. The smile that said he'd already made decisions and she was just decoration waiting to find out what they were. The great hall fell silent. Not the respectful silence that usually followed the Alpha King when he spoke, but something thicker, anticipatory. The kind of quiet that comes right before violence or revelation, and the nobles packed into their hereditary seats along both walls couldn't tell which was coming, but they knew it would be spectacular. That's what courts do. They gather to watch their betters destroy each other and call it politics. Darius wore black that night. Seraphina remembered that detail with perfect clarity later, during the sleepless hours when memory becomes torture. Black leather trimmed with silver wolf head clasps, his crown a simple band of dark metal that somehow made him look more dangerous than any ornate piece of gold work ever could. He'd built an empire with those hands. Unified 17 fractured packs under one banner through a combination of tactical brilliance and calculated brutality that historians would spend decades analyzing. And she'd been there for all of it, standing beside him during the blood treaty negotiations, hosting the tribal councils that brought the eastern packs into the fold, organizing supply lines during the northern campaigns while he led the army through mountain passes everyone said were impassable. 10 years of partnership, 10 years of shared strategy and midnight planning sessions, and the slow, careful construction of something that would outlive them both. Or so she'd believed. Darius raised his hand and the servants moved like they'd been choreographed. The great doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and Seraphina felt something cold slide down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the ancient stone. She knew. In that moment before the woman appeared, some animal part of her brain that still remembered when they were all just wolves in the dark understood exactly what was happening. Lady Celine Morcant entered like she owned the room. Maybe she already did. She wore white, which was either breathtakingly bold or deliberately insulting depending on how you chose to interpret it. White silk that clung to curves that had apparently become familiar to the king somewhere between the spring campaigns and the autumn harvest. Her hair fell in black waves past her shoulders, and her smile was the kind of beautiful that made men stupid and women dangerous. Seraphina had met her before. Minor nobility from the southern provinces, family with more bloodline than coin, the kind of house that sent their prettiest daughters to court hoping one would catch the right eye. Apparently this one had. Celine walked the length of the hall between tables loaded with roasted meat and honeyed wine, and the first fruits of the season that wouldn't last much longer before the deep freeze came. Every eye followed her. Seraphina's vision narrowed to a tunnel, everything peripheral falling away until there was only the woman in white and the man in black, and the vast space between them that was about to collapse. She stopped at the base of the dais. Right below where Seraphina sat in her own throne, the one carved from white oak and inlaid with silver. The queen's throne. Hers by marriage and blood oath and 10 years of service to a vision she'd believed in. Celine sank into a curtsy that managed to be both technically perfect and vaguely mocking. When she rose, her eyes flicked to Seraphina for just a second, long enough to deliver a message, long enough to smile. Darius spoke and his voice carried to every corner of that massive hall without him having to raise it. Alpha Timber. The voice that had commanded armies and silenced rebellions, and once upon a time had whispered promises in the dark that Seraphina had been naive enough to believe were permanent. I stand before you tonight to honor truth. His words. Serafina would remember them exactly, the way you remember the specific shape of the knife that cuts you. The moon goddess teaches us that deception weakens the pack, that secrets rot foundations, that a kingdom built on anything less than absolute honesty with our people is a kingdom already falling. The irony was so thick Serafina could taste it, or maybe that was blood. She'd bitten the inside of her cheek without noticing, and now copper flooded her mouth, while her husband lectured 300 nobles about honesty. For too long I have hidden a truth from this court, from our people, from the empire we have built together. Darius reached down and Selene took his hand, let him draw her up the steps until she stood beside him, beside the king, in the space that belonged to Serafina, no longer does. That verb tense change happened without anyone announcing it, but everyone in the room felt the shift. Lady Selene Morcant is my true companion, the bond the goddess intended. The match that will strengthen our bloodline and secure the future of this empire. Somewhere in the hall a woman gasped. Someone else dropped a plate, and the ceramic shattering against stone sounded like bones breaking. But most of the nobles stayed quiet. Shock, maybe. Or calculation. Already working out which way to jump when the wreckage settled. That's what happens when you gather vipers in formal wear and teach them to call it civilization. They don't waste time on sympathy. They're too busy deciding whether you're still useful or if you've become food. Serafina stood. She didn't plan it. Her body moved independent of thought, muscle memory from 1,000 state functions where protocol lived in her bones. Stand when announced, sit when dismissed, smile when required, bleed internally and keep your spine straight. She rose and every eye in the hall swung from Selene to her and back again, watching to see which woman would survive the next 60 seconds with her dignity intact. Darius met her gaze. No apology there, no regret, just that same flat calculation she'd seen him use on enemy generals right before he destroyed them. And that's when she understood. This wasn't passion, wasn't some tragic romance where he'd fallen helplessly in love and had to follow his heart no matter the cost. This was strategy. Cold political theater staged for maximum impact. He'd chosen the lunar banquet specifically because it was the highest profile event of the season. Wanted everyone to see. Wanted the humiliation public and undeniable so there would be no walking it back later. The question was why? What did he gain from burning his queen in front of the entire court when discretion would have been simpler, cleaner? Kings had mistresses. That was hardly revolutionary. But publicly displacing your wife during a sacred festival while announcing your whore as your true companion, that was declaration. That was a message being sent. Serafina just didn't understand the language yet. She smiled. Didn't plan that either, but some part of her that had been queen longer than she'd been wife kicked in. Survival instinct, armor, the smile that had negotiated treaties and stared down warlords and never once let anyone see her bleed where they could use it against her. How wonderful. Her voice came out steady, clear, projecting to the back rows without strain because she'd been trained for this since childhood. Public speaking, public bleeding, same skill set. I'm so pleased you found happiness, my king. The formal address, creating distance, claiming the moral high ground through perfect protocol while he stood there, having just shattered every rule of civilized behavior. And Lady Selene, welcome to the family. I do hope you understand what you're inheriting. The last sentence carried teeth. Selene heard them. Her smile slipped for just a fraction of a second before sliding back into place. But Serafina saw it, saw the calculation behind those pretty eyes, saw something else too. Triumph, maybe, or cruelty. Hard to tell the difference when they wore the same face. Serafina descended the dais, walked the length of the hall with her head up, and her steps measured and her hands completely steady now because she'd remembered how to do this, how to survive when everything was falling apart. You became marble, became ice, became the thing they couldn't break because stone doesn't break. It just endures. The nobles parted for her. Most wouldn't meet her eyes. Cowards. Already choosing sides, and she hadn't even left the room yet. She made it to her chambers before the shaking started, before the ice cracked, and the marble fractured and the queen who'd smiled her way through ritual execution collapsed against the door, with her hand pressed to her mouth to keep the sounds inside. Her ladies would be coming soon. They always came. But for 30 seconds she had privacy, and she used it the way queens have always used stolen moments. She fell apart where no one could see. Then she pulled herself together, wiped her face, straightened her crown, started thinking. Because betrayal clarifies things, strips away the comfortable lies you tell yourself about partnership and shared vision and love, leaves only the truth underneath. And the truth was simple. Darius had just declared war, not with armies or declarations, with humiliation. And if Seraphina was going to survive what came next, she needed to understand why. The knock came exactly when expected. Her head lady in waiting, Margot, entering with that careful expression that meant she'd already heard and was trying to figure out how to address a queen who might not be queen much longer. The older woman had served Seraphina's mother before her, had taught a princess how to navigate court politics before that princess became a queen, had seen empires rise and fall and kept her head by being useful and discreet, and absolutely loyal to whoever currently held the power to protect her. My lady, not my queen. Message received. I've drawn you a bath, and there are certain items you may wish to secure before morning. Translation: get your valuables somewhere safe before Darius decides to strip you of everything you own along with your dignity. Seraphina nodded, started mentally cataloging what mattered, the personal accounts she'd maintained separately from the royal treasury, her mother's jewelry, the letters. God, the letters. 10 years of correspondence with every major house in the empire. Proof of alliances and debts and promises that had kept this kingdom stitched together when military force alone would have failed. Hidden files too. Because Seraphina hadn't just been decoration these past 10 years. She'd been partner, strategist, the one who managed the politics while Darius played soldier. And you don't manage an empire without learning where the bodies are buried. Metaphorically and literally, she bathed, changed, dismissed Margot with instructions to pack the important items discreetly and move them to the summer residence before dawn. Then she sat in the dark by her window and watched the capital spread out below. Lights burning in noble houses where they were probably discussing her humiliation over brandy and cigars, deciding which way to lean, whether to acknowledge her in the corridors anymore or pretend she'd already become invisible. The knock this time wasn't expected, and it wasn't Margot's careful tap. This was harder, insistent, male. Seraphina's hand went to the knife she'd started carrying after the northern campaigns. Old habit. Courts were more dangerous than battlefields because at least on battlefields you knew who was trying to kill you. She opened the door to find Commander Cale Draven standing in the corridor, looking like he'd ridden hard and hadn't bothered to clean up first. Mud on his boots, dust in his hair, the left side of his face carrying the scars that had earned him the name Draven the Broken after the siege of Thorngate Keep. Darius had exiled him 8 months ago for questioning orders during the Eastern Campaign, sent him to patrol the northern wastes where nothing happened and careers went to die. Apparently he'd come back. Close the door. His voice was rough from cold or shouting, or both. Unless you want the whole palace knowing we're talking. Seraphina stepped back and let him in. Kept the knife in her hand because exile did things to men, and she didn't know what version of Kyle was standing in her chambers right now. The loyal commander who'd fought beside them for years or something newer and more desperate. Cale saw the blade and smiled. No humor in it, just recognition. Smart. Should have kept that attitude 8 months ago. Maybe you'd have seen tonight coming. What are you doing here? She didn't ask, stated, kept her voice flat, gave nothing away. Saving your life, probably. He moved to the window, checked the sight lines like a man expecting trouble, found a shadow he liked, and settled into it. You think tonight was about love? About Darius falling for a pretty face and making stupid choices because his cock overrode his brain? Seraphina waited. Let the silence pull. It's not. Cale's eyes found hers across the dark room. They're planning to kill you, Celine and her family. They've been planning it for at least a year, maybe longer. And your husband is either too stupid to see it or he's actively helping them. The words landed like punches. Seraphina felt them hit, absorbed the impact, started rearranging everything she thought she understood about tonight. Why? Why would they need to kill her? Darius could just divorce her, annul the marriage, send her back to her family with a settlement and a polite fiction about incompatibility. Because you're not just his wife. Cale said it like she was an idiot for not seeing it. You're the one who holds the loyalty of half the generals, 3/4 of the noble houses. Every alliance that built this empire has your fingerprints on it. Not his, yours. Darius commanded the army, but you commanded everything else. And you're too competent to leave alive if they want to tear it all down and rebuild it with their people in charge. That's insane. But even as she said it, pieces were clicking together. The Treasury reports she'd been shut out of reviewing for the past 6 months. The new appointments to the Royal Guard that bypassed her approval. Border packs rebelling in regions that had been stable for years. Little fractures she'd noticed but dismissed because they seemed random, disconnected. What if they weren't? I have proof. Cale pulled a leather folder from inside his coat, dropped it on the table between them. Financial records, troop movements, correspondence between Celine's father and rival Alpha clans who've been waiting for an excuse to challenge Darius for decades. They've been bleeding the treasury, buying loyalty, positioning their people in key positions throughout the government and military. Tonight wasn't about passion. It was phase 2 of a coup. Serafina opened the folder, started reading. Her hands didn't shake anymore. That particular weakness had burned away somewhere between the banquet and this moment, replaced by something colder and more useful. Clarity, purpose. The thing that happens when you stop being a victim and start being a threat. The numbers were damning. Million-mark transfers to accounts she didn't recognize. Weapon shipments to packs that should have been neutral. Letters in Celine's handwriting discussing timing and phases and acceptable losses. And there, buried in the middle, a single line that made Serafina's blood ice over. The queen must be removed before the blood moon ceremony. Make it look natural. Grief will serve our purposes better than murder. 3 months away. They'd given her 3 months to live. She looked up at Kael. Why are you telling me this? You hate Darius. He exiled you. Why not let this play out and watch him burn? Because I don't hate the Empire. Kael's voice went hard. I served this kingdom before Darius took the throne. Fought for it when it was 7 different territories trying to murder each other over trade routes and old grudges. Watched you and him build something that actually worked for once. Something that protected people instead of just feeding off them. And I'm not letting some southern house with delusions of grandeur tear it apart because your husband got stupid. He pushed off from the wall, came close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the anger, the same cold calculation she was feeling settle into her own chest. So here's the question, my queen, emphasis on the title. Claiming it when everyone else was already abandoning it. Are you going to run? Take whatever valuables you can carry and disappear before they decide to move up the timeline? Or are you going to fight? Serafina thought about her mother, a queen from a smaller kingdom who'd married for alliance and spent 30 years turning political necessity into genuine power. Who'd taught her daughter that crowns weren't given, they were taken, that survival at the top meant being smarter and meaner, and more patient than everyone trying to pull you down, who died in her bed at 70 with her throne secure and her enemies buried and her legacy carved into stone. She thought about Darius, the man she'd loved once, maybe still did in whatever broken way you keep loving someone after they've destroyed you. The empire they'd built together, the vision of something better than the endless cycle of pack wars and strongman rule that had defined this continent for centuries. She thought about Celine, that smile at the banquet, that moment of triumph, the casual cruelty of a woman who thought she'd already won. Then she smiled. And it wasn't the public smile. Wasn't the diplomatic mask she wore for courts and councils. This was something else. Something Kael recognized because his own expression shifted, became wary, became interested. I'm going to burn them. Her voice came out soft, almost gentle. The kind of tone that made smart people nervous because it meant violence was coming wrapped in silk. All of them. Celine and her family, and every noble house that's been waiting to carve up this empire like it's a carcass they have rights to. And when I'm done, they're going to remember exactly why you don't betray a queen who knows where the bodies are buried. Kael's smile was sharp enough to cut. Good, because I brought friends. Exiled commanders aren't popular, but we're very motivated. And we know things about how this empire actually runs that Darius has forgotten, if he ever knew. They spent the next 4 hours planning. Serafina pulled maps and ledgers and correspondence from hidden compartments in her chambers that Margot had been maintaining for exactly this kind of emergency. Because you didn't survive court politics without contingencies, without escape routes and blackmail files and lists of who owed you favors that could be called in when desperation became necessity. The treasury records Kael had brought showed the bleeding clearly once you knew what to look for. Shell companies, false vendors, payments for services never rendered. Celine's family had been siphoning funds for at least 3 years. Millions of marks that should have gone to infrastructure and military pay and the social programs that kept the lower packs from rebellion. Instead, it had gone to buying loyalty and funding rivals and building a shadow network that was positioned to tear the empire apart from inside. Worse, they'd been competent about it. Careful. The kind of long-term planning that meant this wasn't opportunistic. They'd been preparing since before Celine ever caught Darius's eye. Maybe before Serafina had even married him. A decade-long play to position themselves at the heart of power and then rip it out when the moment came. The border rebellions weren't random. They were funded, coordinated, designed to stretch the royal army thin and create the appearance of weakness. Make Darius look ineffective. Make the nobles question whether he still had the strength to hold the empire together. Set the stage for someone new to step in and save everyone from the chaos. Someone married to the king. Someone whose family already had their people in every key position. And the Blood Moon ceremony. The sacred festival where the Alpha King renewed his vows to the kingdom and the pact bonds were reinforced through ritual and blood oath. If Serafina died right before it, died naturally from grief or illness or accident, Darius would perform the ceremony with Celine at his side instead, legitimizing her. Making her queen, in fact, instead of just the king's whore, giving her family everything they needed to complete the coup without ever having to openly rebel. It was brilliant. It was vicious. And it would have worked if Kael hadn't been paranoid enough to keep watching after his exile. If he hadn't maintained contacts inside the palace who still fed him information. If he hadn't decided that saving the empire mattered more than his personal grudge against the man who'd humiliated him. We need allies. Serafina marked houses on the map, noble families who owed her favors, generals who respected her, packs whose loyalty ran to the crown itself rather than whoever currently wore it. Not enough to fight a war. Not yet. But enough to start building opposition. Enough to make Celine's family think twice about their timeline. And we need evidence they can't deny. Kael tapped the financial records. These are good, but they're not enough. We need something public. Something that proves the conspiracy to enough people that Darius can't just dismiss it as a jealous wife making accusations. The ceremony itself. Serafina saw it forming, a trap built from their own plan. They're expecting me to be dead or broken by then. Instead, I'll be there. With proof. With allies. And I'll expose everything in front of the entire empire during the most sacred ritual of the year. Risky. Kael studied her. You'll have one shot. If you're wrong about the timing. If they move faster than expected. If Darius refuses to listen. Then I'll be dead. Serafina met his eyes. But I'll be dead anyway if I run. At least this way I take them with me. They worked until dawn, building networks, identifying targets, planning contingencies for the contingencies. When Margot knocked to announce that the items had been moved and the palace was waking, Kael slipped out through the servant passages he'd apparently mapped during his years of service. Before he left, he turned back. One more thing. His voice was quiet, serious in a way that made Serafina pay attention. If this goes the way I think it's going to go, if we survive and expose them and somehow pull this empire back from the edge, you need to be ready to rule. Not as queen consort, as queen. Because Darius is either a fool or a traitor, and either way he's not fit to hold power anymore. The words hung in the air between them. Treason or truth. Probably both. Serafina nodded. One step at a time. First we survive. Then we win. Then we worry about what comes after. Kael smiled that broken smile and disappeared into the shadows. Serafina stood alone in her chambers, watching the sunrise paint the capital gold and red, blood and treasure, empire and ashes. All of it balanced on the next 3 months, and her ability to be smarter and meaner and more patient than everyone trying to kill her. She'd been trained for this her whole life, just never expected to use those lessons against her own husband. The morning brought summons, not from Darius, from the royal steward informing her that her presence would no longer be required at state functions, that her household budget was being reduced, that certain privileges of rank were being redistributed. Polite bureaucratic language for we're stripping your power and there's nothing you can do about it. Serafina read the notice, smiled, Sent back a response confirming receipt and thanking the steward for his diligent attention to duty. Gave nothing away. Let them think she was beaten, broken, already fading into irrelevance. Then she called Margot and started implementing phase 1. The old lady arrived with tea and the kind of carefully neutral expression that meant she'd been listening to palace gossip all morning. My lady. Still not my queen. We have a situation. Several, probably. Serafina poured tea with steady hands. Tell me which one requires immediate attention. Lord Corvin requests an audience. Margot's voice was careful. He says it's regarding mutual interests and past favors owed. Serafina's mind raced. Corvin. Northern Territories. One of the first houses to swear fealty when Darius was consolidating power. She'd personally negotiated the treaty that brought his lands into the empire after his father died in the succession wars, saved his house from being absorbed by rivals. He owed her. Question was whether he remembered. Send him in. And Margot. Have someone watch who's watching. I need to know if we're being monitored. The lady nodded and withdrew, returned 10 minutes later with a man who'd aged hard since Serafina. Fina saw him last. Lord Corvin had been a young warrior when they'd first met. Now he was in his 40s with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes that came from hard decisions and harder winters. He bowed. Proper depth. Proper respect. Acknowledging her rank even though the palace had just publicly reduced it. My queen. The title was deliberate. Claiming it when using it could be dangerous. I hear you've had an interesting evening. That's one word for it. Serafina gestured to a chair. What brings you to my chambers when the wise course would be pretending you don't know me anymore? Corvin sat. Met her eyes directly. Because I'm not wise. I'm loyal. And because I just received a very interesting offer from Lady Celine's family. They want to buy timber rights to my northern forests at triple the market rate. Immediate payment. Contract signed before the blood moon ceremony. Serafina felt something click. Timber. Northern forests. The kind of dense hardwood you needed for siege weapons, for building fortifications, for preparing for war. And you said, I said I'd consider it. Corvin's smile was thin. Then I did some checking. Turns out 6 other northern houses got similar offers in the past month, all of them for strategic resources, all of them with the same timeline, all of them from Celine's people using shell companies and intermediaries. They're preparing for conflict. Serafina said it quietly. Buying up war materials before anyone realizes what's happening. Worse. Corvin leaned forward. They're buying loyalty. Every house that takes these contracts becomes financially dependent on them. And financially compromised if things go bad. They're building a coalition that's too invested in their success to back out when the truth comes out. How many houses have accepted? 4 that I know of. Probably more. Corvin's expression was grim. They're offering money that houses like ours can't refuse. The Northern Territories have been struggling since the trade routes shifted south. This kind of capital injection could save estates that are one bad winter away from collapse. So they're using our economic failures against us. Serafina felt the shape of it forming, a coup built on desperation and greed as much as ambition. Offer salvation to struggling houses, make them complicit. Then when the empire falls apart, they're already on the winning side whether they wanted to be or not. What do you need from me? Corvin's voice was steady. I didn't come here to give you information and leave. I came to help. Tell me what you need. Serafina studied him. Calculated risk. Trust. The thing that got her into this mess in the first place, but also the only thing that could get her out. I need you to accept their offer, sign the contract, take the money. Then I need you to document everything. Every communication, every payment, every detail of who contacted you and when and what they said. Build me a case so airtight that even Darius can't ignore it. You want me to be bait. I want you to be evidence. Serafina's voice was hard. And yes, bait. Because we're going to expose this conspiracy, and we need nobles who can testify to exactly how they were corrupted. First-hand witnesses who benefited from the scheme and are willing to turn. Corvin was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, but I want to promise. When this is over, when you've won and they're gone, you remember who helped. You remember houses like mine that took the risk. Done. Serafina extended her hand. They shook on it. Old style. The kind of oath that meant something before lawyers and contracts made everything complicated. Corvin left through the front door, making it obvious he'd visited, planting seeds of doubt in whoever was watching about whose side he was really on. Smart, risky. Exactly the kind of move they needed. The next week was a lesson in controlled collapse. Serafina watched her authority erode piece by piece. Her household staff was reduced. Her invitations to state functions stopped coming. Nobles who'd sought her counsel for years suddenly became too busy to meet. The court was realigning, choosing Celine, or at least choosing not to openly defy the king's obvious preference. But underneath the visible decay, Serafina was building. Kael brought her 3 more exiled commanders who'd rather die fighting for the empire than watch it rot from exile. Lord Corvin introduced her to 2 other northern houses who'd received similar offers and were willing to turn evidence. Margot's network of servants and ladies-in-waiting became an intelligence apparatus that tracked every movement Celine made, every meeting her family held, every whisper in the corridors. And Serafina learned, studied her enemy the way she'd once studied battle maps and diplomatic treaties, learned that Celine's family had been minor nobility for 3 generations, but used to be major players before a failed rebellion 2 centuries ago cost them their lands and titles. Learned that they'd spent those 2 centuries nursing a grudge and planning a return to power. Learned that Celine had 6 brothers, all of them positioned in key military and administrative roles throughout the empire, all of them waiting for the signal to move. This wasn't just a coup, it was a restoration, and they'd been planning it longer than Serafina had been alive. The realization should have been terrifying. Instead, it was clarifying, because long plans had weaknesses. Assumptions built over decades that might not account for new variables, like a queen who refused to die quietly, like an exiled commander who kept watching when he should have stopped caring, like a network of northern houses who remembered favors and honored debts even when convenience suggested otherwise. 6 weeks before the blood moon ceremony, Darius summoned her. First time she'd been in the same room with him since the banquet. He received her in his study, not the throne room, making it personal. Or trying to. He looked tired. That was her first thought. Whatever satisfaction he'd gained from publicly humiliating her had worn thin under the weight of actually running an empire that was slowly fracturing. The border rebellions were getting worse. 2 provinces had stopped sending tax revenue. The generals were divided over resource allocation and strategy. All the little problems that Serafina used to solve before they became big problems. Sit. He didn't look at her. Kept his attention on the map spread across his desk. We need to talk about the ceremony. Serafina sat, kept her hands folded, her expression neutral, waiting. You won't be attending, it was stated, not discussed. Celine will stand beside me. She'll take the oaths. It's better this way. Cleaner. Cleaner for who? The question came out flat. No heat. Just curiosity about how he was justifying this to himself. For everyone. Darius finally met her eyes, and there was something there. Not guilt exactly. Maybe regret. Maybe just exhaustion. You and I both know this marriage stopped working years ago. We stayed together for the empire, for stability. But that's not enough anymore. So you're replacing me with your mistress and calling it progress. I'm choosing a partner who can give me heirs, who can solidify alliances with houses we need, who understands what's required at this level. Darius's voice hardened. You were a good queen, Serafina, but you're too rigid, too invested in the old ways. The empire is changing, and we need to change with it. The empire is falling apart. She said it quietly, watching his reaction. Border packs are rebelling, the treasury is bleeding, our generals are divided, and you think the solution is better breeding stock. He flinched. Good. She'd meant it to land. The problems are temporary, adjustments, growing pains. Darius was convincing himself more than her. Celine's family has connections that will stabilize the situation, resources we can use. This is strategic. Is that what she told you? Or is that what you're telling yourself so you can sleep at night? Get out. The Alpha command. The voice that had led armies. Except it didn't work on her anymore. Maybe never had. She was queen, not pack, not subject to the same hierarchy that bent lesser wolves to his will. Serafina stood. As you wish. But Darius, one thing. She waited until he looked at her. When this falls apart, when you realize what she really is and what her family is actually doing, don't come to me expecting sympathy. I'll remember that you chose this. Chose her. Chose to throw away 10 years of partnership for whatever fantasy she sold you about power and progeny and political advantage. She left before he could respond, before he could see that her hands were shaking again. Not from fear this time, from rage. Pure concentrated fury that she was channeling into something useful, something sharp. 4 weeks before the ceremony, the first of Celine's plans became visible. 3 generals loyal to Serafina were quietly reassigned to remote posts. No explanation, no consultation. Just orders from the king moving people who might object at inconvenient moments. Kael's network flagged it immediately, sent word through channels they'd established. And Serafina added it to the growing file of evidence that Darius was either actively helping the conspiracy or had become such a useful idiot that the distinction didn't matter. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Lord Corvin sent word that the timber had been delivered to a location that made no sense for commercial purposes, but perfect sense for staging military supplies near the capital. Other houses reported similar movements: weapons, food stores, everything you'd need to sustain an occupying force or siege a city. They weren't planning to wait until after the ceremony. They were going to move during it, use the sacred ritual as cover for a hostile takeover. And they were going to kill Serafina in the chaos and blame it on loyalists who couldn't accept the new order. Kael laid it out in her chambers during one of their midnight planning sessions. They're going to hit us during the ceremony. Maximum chaos, maximum witnesses. They'll control the narrative before anyone can respond. You'll be dead. Darius will be shocked and grieving, and Celine will be queen with an empire too fractured to resist the transition. Then we move first. Serafina's voice was calm, cold. The woman who'd negotiated treaties and managed crises for a decade. We expose them before they can strike. During the ceremony. In front of everyone. With enough evidence that Darius can't ignore it, and the nobles can't pretend they didn't know. That's suicide. One of the other exiled commanders spoke up. A woman named Sarah who'd lost an eye in the Eastern campaigns. You'll be alone in a hall full of their people. No guards, no protection. They'll kill you the moment you start talking. Not if I have an army at my back. Serafina looked at Kael. How many can you bring? 40. Maybe 50 if we pull everyone. Exiled soldiers, loyal guards who haven't been reassigned yet. Not enough to fight their whole force, but enough to make them think twice about open violence in front of the court. And we'll have the northern houses. Lord Corvin had brought 6 more into the fold, all of them ready to testify. All of them armed and positioned. Make it a standoff. Force Darius to choose publicly between his wife and his mistress when the evidence is undeniable. It was insane, it was desperate, it was the only play they had left. 1 week before the Blood Moon ceremony, Margot brought news that changed everything. My lady, her voice was shaking. The old woman who'd seen everything was genuinely afraid. I found something in Celine's chambers. Letters. She's been corresponding with the Eastern Pax, the ones who've been raiding our borders. Serafina took the papers, read them, felt ice slide down her spine. They weren't just funding rebellion. They were coordinating with external enemies, promising them territory in exchange for military support during the transition, planning to carve up the empire and distribute pieces to whoever helped them seize power. This was beyond coup. This was treason. Collaboration with foreign powers to destroy the kingdom from within. If the evidence was real and could be proven, even Darius would have to act. Even his obsession with Celine couldn't survive proof that she was actively working to dismantle everything he'd built. Where did you get these? One of her ladies is loyal to you, has been from the beginning. Margot's eyes were fierce. Took the risk because she understands what's happening. These are copies. The originals are still in Celine's possession, but we have enough to prove authenticity. Serafina felt something shift. The endgame forming, not just survival anymore. Victory. Real permanent victory that would end this threat forever and restore order to an empire on the edge of collapse. Get word to Kael and to Corvin. Tell them we move during the ceremony as planned, but add this to the evidence. Make sure every noble in that hall sees exactly who they've been bowing to. And make sure the documentation is airtight because we're only going to get one chance to make this case. The final week was a blur. Positioning people. Confirming evidence. running through scenarios and contingencies until Serafina could navigate the ceremony in her sleep. She barely ate, didn't sleep except in short stretches that left her more exhausted than rest. But her mind was clear, focused, sharp in the way that only comes when everything else has been burned away and only purpose remains. The night before the ceremony, Kael came to her chambers one last time. Brought a sword, simple blade, good steel. Nothing fancy, but weighted properly for someone her size. Tomorrow gets ugly. His voice was quiet. You should be armed. Serafina took the weapon, felt the balance. I thought we were doing this with evidence, not violence. We're doing it with both. Kael met her eyes. Because if Darius refuses to act even with proof, if he's too compromised or too stupid or too in love to do what's necessary, then you're going to have to do it yourself. And that means being ready to fight your way out. She nodded. Understood. Tomorrow she was either saving the Empire or dying in the attempt. Probably both. Definitely either. No middle ground left. Are you afraid? Kael asked it honestly. Just curious. Not judging. Terrified. Serafina smiled. But I've been terrified before. Turns out you can function just fine with fear eating you alive as long as you don't let it make your decisions. Good answer. He turned to leave. Stopped. Queen, when this is over, if we survive, Empire's going to need someone who actually understands how to run it. Just keep that in mind. Then he was gone, and Serafina was alone with her sword and her evidence and the weight of 10 years of choices that had led to tomorrow. She stood by the window watching the capital settle into night, lights going dark in noble houses, guards changing shifts in the palace. Somewhere out there, Celine was probably celebrating, thinking she'd already won, that the ceremony tomorrow was just formality before coronation. Serafina smiled. Tomorrow, Selena would learn the same lesson Serafina had learned at the lunar banquet. That certainty was an illusion, that the moment you thought you'd won was usually when you'd already lost. That queens didn't survive by being loved or feared, but by being underestimated right up until the knife came out. She went to bed with the sword beside her, didn't sleep, watched the ceiling and thought about her mother, about the lessons learned in childhood that had seemed like stories but turned out to be survival manuals, about power and betrayal and the cost of empire, about everything she was about to risk and everything she stood to lose and the vast terrible clarity of being completely out of options except the most dangerous one. Dawn came slowly, red sky through her windows. Blood morning. Appropriate. Serafina dressed carefully, not in royal finery, in fighting leathers under a simple gown, practical, armed, ready for whatever today brought. Margot helped her prepare without speaking, no words left that would help. Just two women who understood that everything was about to change, and there was no going back from what came next. The blood moon ceremony was scheduled for midday. When the sun hit its peak and the ancient rituals said the barrier between worlds was thinnest. When oaths made before the goddess carried permanent weight. When kings renewed their bonds to the pack, and the pack renewed their bonds to the crown, and everything that held civilization together got reinforced through blood and belief and the kind of magic that predated words. Serafina walked to the great hall with her evidence folded inside her gown and her sword concealed in her skirts, and her heart beating steady because terror had become just another thing she carried. The halls were full of nobles heading the same direction. Most ignored her, some stared, a few nodded with respect they probably shouldn't have risked showing. She noted faces, memorized who acknowledged her and who pretended she didn't exist. Would matter later if there was a later. The great hall had been transformed, candles everywhere, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, creating pools of light and shadow that made the ancient space feel even more massive, even more sacred. Nobles packed the galleries and floor space. Witnesses, as required by tradition, as required by law. You couldn't perform the blood moon ceremony in private. Had to be public, had to be seen. The whole empire binding itself together under watching eyes. Serafina found her place. Not on the dais. That spot belonged to Celine now. Serafina stood with the displaced, the former, the forgotten. Good. Better to attack from unexpected quarters. Better to be underestimated. Darius entered wearing ceremonial black, crown and cloak, and the kind of presence that still commanded rooms even after everything. Celine walked beside him in white, again white, making a statement, claiming purity, claiming destiny. Her family spread throughout the hall in key positions, 6 brothers, their supporters, armed, waiting. The ceremony began. Ancient words and languages most people no longer spoke, priests invoking the goddess and the moons and the bonds that held pacts together. Ritual responses from the assembled nobles, Darius and Celine at the center of it all, playing their parts, performing power. Serafina waited. Let them get deep into it. Let the sacred weight build. Let every noble in the hall feel the solemnity of what was happening. Then she moved, stepped forward, into the open space between the dais and the assembled court, where supplicants stood when they had grievances, where challenges were issued under the goddess's gaze, where truth was demanded and lies were exposed and blood could be spilled legally if the cause was just. The ceremony stopped. Every eye turned to her. Darius's expression went from shock to fury to calculation in seconds. Celine's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. The kind of cold that confirmed everything Serafina suspected, everything she was about to prove. And Serafina spoke, voice clear, carrying to every corner of that massive hall. No fear, no hesitation, just truth delivered with the kind of authority that came from being absolutely certain you were right. I claim the right of testimony before the goddess and this assembled court. Ancient formula, legal, undeniable under ceremony law. I accuse Lady Celine Morcant and her family of treason, of conspiracy against the crown, of collaboration with foreign enemies, of theft from the royal treasury, of planning regicide and coup, and I have proof. The hall exploded. Shouts, denials, nobles surging forward and back, Celine's brothers moving to positions that looked defensive but were clearly preparation for violence. Darius standing frozen on the dais trying to process what was happening. And Serafina held up the documents. Financial records, letters, testimony from northern houses, evidence compiled over weeks of desperate investigation, everything laid bare in front of the empire's most powerful witnesses during the most sacred ceremony of the year. But before she could say another word, before she could present the evidence that would either save her or kill her, the great doors burst open and Kael rushed in with blood on his sword and terror in his eyes. "They're here!" His voice cut through the chaos. "The Eastern Pax. They're attacking the capital. Right now. It's already started." The sound of steel meeting steel echoed through the palace corridors. Screaming followed, then smoke. Serafina smelled it before she saw it, that acrid burn of wood and flesh that meant the city was already dying outside these walls. The Eastern Pax hadn't just attacked, they'd coordinated, struck during the one moment when every noble, every commander, every person with authority was locked inside this hall performing rituals instead of defending their territory. Kael's blood-slicked sword told her everything about how close the enemy had gotten, how fast, how prepared they were for exactly this moment. Darius finally moved, snapped out of whatever paralysis had frozen him when Serafina made her accusations. His voice carried alpha command across the chaos. "Seal the hall, defensive positions, get the nobles to the interior chambers, now." But Celine's brothers were already moving, not to defensive positions, moving to surround the dais, weapons drawn, faces set with the kind of cold purpose that confirmed they'd been waiting for this exact scenario. One of them, the eldest with a scar running jaw to temple, locked eyes with Celine, gave a small nod. And Serafina understood. The attack wasn't a complication. It was the plan. Eastern Pax weren't invading. They were arriving on schedule. Celine's family hadn't been funding rebellion. They'd been coordinating an invasion, and every person in this hall was now trapped between hostile forces outside and traitors inside. Darius, her voice cut through the noise, sharp enough that he looked at her on instinct. "Your generals, where are they?" He blinked, started to process. The ones loyal to him, to the Empire, had been reassigned weeks ago, sent to remote posts. The ones here now, the ones who should have been organizing defense, were either Celine's people or compromised enough to hesitate when hesitation meant death. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Serafina watched it happen. Watched the king who'd built an empire through tactical brilliance finally understand he'd been outmaneuvered by his own arrogance, by his cock, by his absolute certainty that his judgment was infallible and anyone questioning it was just jealous or weak. They played you. She said it without heat, just fact, statement of reality. And now we're all going to die because you were too stupid to see it. Celine stepped forward, still wearing that white gown, still beautiful, still smiling that smile that had probably been the last thing a dozen people saw before they disappeared. Your accusations are desperate, my queen. The title dripped venom. An enemy attacks and you use it to spread lies. How very predictable. Serafina pulled the documents from inside her gown, held them high enough for the nearest nobles to see. These are financial records showing your family has stolen 18 million marks from the royal treasury over 3 years. Letters in your handwriting coordinating with Eastern Alpha clans. Testimony from 6 northern houses about your attempts to buy loyalty and position military resources. And correspondence proving you planned to assassinate the king during this ceremony and blame it on loyalist resistance. She threw the papers, let them scatter across the marble floor between them. Darius bent, picked up the nearest sheet, started reading, and Serafina watched color drain from his face as he recognized the evidence, as he understood what his obsession had invited into the heart of his empire. You told me I was rigid, that I didn't understand what the empire needed. Serafina's voice was conversational now, almost gentle. You were half right. I didn't understand. Didn't see that what you needed was validation more than strategy, approval more than truth. Someone who would tell you that your instincts were perfect when they were leading us all off a cliff. The doors shuddered, something massive hitting them from outside. The Eastern packs weren't subtle about their entry methods. They were coming through with force and speed and the kind of coordinated assault that required months of planning. Maps of the palace, knowledge of guard rotations, inside information about where everyone would be during the ceremony. Information. Celine's family had been feeding them while Darius was too busy being worshipped to notice the betrayal happening under his own roof. Kael appeared at Serafina's side, 40 soldiers with him, the exiled commanders and loyal guards who'd been positioned outside specifically for this moment. Not enough to fight an army, enough to make whoever moved first think about the cost. My queen. He said it loud, making sure every noble heard the title, making sure Darius heard it. What are your orders? Serafina felt something shift inside her chest, the last piece of whoever she'd been burning away. She'd spent 10 years as partner, as consort, as the woman who stood beside power and wielded it through persuasion and political grace. That woman was dead, had died at the lunar banquet, or maybe in the weeks since. What was left was something colder, something that understood survival at this level meant being willing to do what no one else would, mean what no one else could, take the weight and carry it because the alternative was extinction. She looked at Darius, found him staring at the papers in his hand with an expression that might have been grief or shock, or just the complete dissolution of everything he'd believed about his own judgment. Then she looked at Celine, found those beautiful eyes watching her with calculation and the first trace of actual concern. Secure the traitors. Serafina's voice carried to every corner of the hall. Celine Morcant and her brothers are under arrest for high treason. Anyone who moves to defend them dies where they stand. Kael's soldiers moved, fast, professional, surrounded Celine's brothers before they could coordinate a response. Weapons leveled, faces hard, men and women who'd been exiled for loyalty and were getting their first taste of vindication in months. But Celine just smiled, looked at Darius. Are you going to let her do this? Let your jealous wife arrest the woman you love based on forged documents and paranoid conspiracy theories? Darius stood there, papers in his hand, proof of betrayal in black ink and testimony, empire collapsing around him, enemy army literally at the gates. And he hesitated, because even now, even with evidence undeniable, some part of him wanted it not to be true, wanted Celine to be what he'd believed she was, wanted his judgment validated. Serafina felt something close to pity. Almost. Then it passed because she'd learned that pity was just another luxury queens couldn't afford. Read the letters, Darius. She kept her voice level, factual. The ones where she discusses killing you, where she plans how to divide the empire between her family and the Eastern clans, where she laughs about how easy you were to manipulate. Read them, and then tell me I'm the one lying. He read. And Serafina watched him break. Not dramatically, Not with rage or shouting, just a quiet internal collapse that showed in the way his shoulders dropped, the way his hands started shaking, the way he finally looked at Celine with something other than infatuation or desire, with recognition of what she actually was underneath the beauty and the performance. "You used me." His voice was barely audible. Everything. The affair, the love, the promises. All of it was just strategy. Celine's mask cracked, just for a second, long enough to let something vicious show through. "Of course I used you." Her voice lost the sweetness, became harder, sharper. "You were a means to an end, a throne my family deserved and lost generations ago because of weak leadership just like yours. And yes, we planned to kill you after you'd served your purpose, after you'd legitimized my position enough that the transition would be smooth." She looked at Serafina, smiled with pure malice. "The only mistake we made was underestimating how long your pathetic wife would keep fighting instead of accepting she was already dead." The doors exploded inward, wood and metal flying in shards as battering rams finally broke through. Eastern Pack warriors poured into the hall. 24, 4, 6, armored, armed, moving with coordinated precision that spoke to professional military training, not raiders, soldiers. And behind them, an Alpha Serafina recognized from intelligence reports, Kira Ashen Fang, Eastern Territories. Reputation for brutality and ambition that had made her a problem for the Empire for years. Young, maybe 30. Scars across both arms from ritual combat, eyes that assessed the hall in seconds and found exactly what she was looking for. Celine. Still standing on the dais, still wearing white that was about to get very bloody. "Lady Morcant." Kira's voice carried command almost as well as Darius's used to. "We're ahead of schedule. Where's the king's corpse?" Celine's expression flickered. Slight delay. "We're handling it. Handling it." Kira looked around the hall, at Celine surrounded by hostile soldiers, at Darius standing there looking broken, at Serafina holding position with 40 guards who were very clearly not part of the plan. "This looks handled to you." The alliance was fracturing in real time. Serafina filed that information away. Used it. Stepped forward before anyone else could speak. Put herself between two enemy forces with nothing but absolute certainty in her voice. "Alpha Kira. You were promised territory and treasure in exchange for military support during a coup." "Correct." Kira's eyes narrowed, assessing threat levels. "Who are you?" "Queen Serafina Vale, and the person who's about to make you a better offer." Darius made a sound. Might have been protest, might have been just shocked that his wife was negotiating with an invading force. Serafina ignored him, kept her focus on Kira because the Eastern Alpha was the real power in the room now. Celine's family had brought muscle they clearly couldn't control. "You were offered what?" "A third of the Northern Territories. Access to trade routes? Permanent settlement rights?" Serafina was guessing, but educated guessing based on what a Borderlands clan would actually want. Not just raid money. Legitimacy. Land. Kira didn't confirm, but her expression said Serafina was close enough. And all you had to do was help them murder a king. Install a puppet government run by southern nobles who've been plotting restoration for 200 years. Then trust that they'd actually honor agreements made in secret with no witnesses and no recourse if they decided you'd outlived your usefulness. That landed. Serafina saw it hit. Because Kira was ambitious, but not stupid, and the kind of people who orchestrate multi-year conspiracies involving regicide and national betrayal weren't exactly known for keeping their word to hired muscle. Serafina pulled another document from her gown, proof she'd held back specifically for this moment. Threw it toward Kira. One of the Eastern warriors caught it, passed it up. The Alpha read fast, and her expression went from neutral to cold fury in seconds. That's correspondence between Celine's family and the Southern Maritime clans, dated 3 weeks ago, discussing how to eliminate Eastern Pack leadership after the coup succeeds, how to break your coalition and absorb your territories into their new empire, how you were always meant to be temporary assets disposed of once you served your purpose. Celine lunged for Kira, desperation moving faster than thought. "That's forged. She's lying. We had a deal." Kira caught her by the throat, lifted her off the ground with one hand, The kind of casual violence that demonstrated exactly what the power differential had always been between Southern courtiers and Eastern warriors. Did you? A deal. While planning to kill me and mine the moment our backs were turned. She looked at Serafina. And you have a better offer. I have the only offer that doesn't end with you dead in a ditch. Serafina's voice was hard. Factual. You want legitimacy, land, recognition. I can give you that. Peace treaty, formal borders, trade agreements honored in writing with witnesses and legal weight. Everything you'd get from them, except actually binding and not dependent on trusting people who've proven they can't be trusted. What's the cost? You leave. Now. Take your warriors and withdraw from the capital. No looting, no burning, clean exit. In exchange, I'll negotiate settlement rights in the disputed borderlands and permanent trade status. Give you what you actually want without the need to wade through blood, and hope you survive the cleanup. Kira was silent, calculating. Her warriors watched her, waiting. Discipline that said they'd follow whatever she decided, but they were hoping it didn't involve dying in a palace hall for southern nobles who'd just proven they were planning betrayal. Why should I believe you'll honor it, any more than they would? Because I need you too. Serafina said it simply. Honestly, my empire is falling apart. My husband is compromised. My military is fractured. I don't have the strength to fight you and rebuild and root out internal corruption simultaneously. But if you withdraw and let me handle the domestic situation, I can offer you something better than conquest. Partnership. The kind that benefits both our people instead of just feeding corpses to the crows. It was insane. Negotiating with an invading force while standing in a room full of traitors and a king who'd just had his entire worldview shattered. But insanity was just another tool, another option when conventional wisdom had already failed. Kira dropped Celine. Let her collapse to the marble floor, choking and furious, looked at her own second-in-command, a massive warrior with ritual scars covering his face. What do you think? The warrior studied Serafina, long enough that she felt the weight of that assessment. Then he smiled, respectful, almost approving. I think she's got bigger stones than half our clan, and I think fighting through this palace to install leaders who are already planning to kill us is a stupid way to die. Kira nodded, looked back at Serafina. You have 1 hour to produce a formal written treaty, signed and witnessed, border coordinates, trade terms, settlement rights, everything documented and legally binding. We'll hold position outside the gates. If you deliver, we withdraw. If you don't, we burn this city to bedrock and sort out leadership from whoever's left. Done. Serafina didn't hesitate. Didn't look to Darius for approval or confirmation, just accepted the terms and moved on because hesitation now meant death for everyone. Kira gestured and her warriors retreated. Professional. Orderly. Not the chaotic rabble Celine's family had probably told Darius the Eastern Pacts were. These were soldiers following a competent commander who just made a tactical decision based on new information. The doors stood open behind them, smoke still drifting in from fires burning somewhere in the city. Reminder that this wasn't over, just paused. Darius finally found his voice. You just negotiated with invaders, gave them concessions, without my authority. I just saved your empire. Serafina turned to face him fully. Your authority was compromised the moment you chose her over basic operational security. And right now, I'm the only person in this room with the credibility to make agreements that will actually hold. So yes, I negotiated, I made concessions, and I bought us time to deal with the actual threat. She pointed at Celine, still on the ground, still beautiful, even with fury distorting her features, still dangerous because cornered vipers were the most lethal kind. That woman and her family spent years planning to destroy everything we built, stole millions, corrupted our government, invited foreign armies into the capital, planned to murder you in front of witnesses and claim your throne through violence and fraud. And you were going to let her stand beside you during the most sacred ceremony of our culture because you couldn't imagine your instincts about her were wrong. The words hit like physical blows. Serafina saw him flinch with each one, saw the king who'd conquered 17 territories realize he'd been conquered himself by basic manipulation and ego. So here's what happens next. Serafina's voice dropped, became colder, harder, the voice of someone who'd run out of patience for weakness. Celine and her brothers go to the dungeons. Every member of their family currently in government or military positions gets arrested. We audit the entire treasury and track every stolen mark. And then we execute them publicly for treason, so every other ambitious house understands what happens when you try to tear this empire apart from inside. You can't order executions, Darius said it weakly. Without conviction. That's the king's authority. Then execute them yourself. Serafina stepped closer, invaded his space, made him look at her, made him see what he'd created through his betrayal and stupidity and absolute refusal to listen to anyone who questioned his judgment. Prove you're still capable of being the king this empire needs. Prove you understand what they did and what it cost. Prove anything other than complete incompetence. Or step down and let someone who can actually lead handle it. The hall was silent. Every noble, every guard, every witness to this conversation that was effectively a coup happening in slow motion through words instead of violence. Serafina was challenging the king's authority in front of the entire court, demanding he either act or abdicate. And she was doing it with enough support from armed soldiers that it wasn't just challenge. It was credible threat. Darius looked at her, and something in his expression changed. Not surrender exactly. Recognition, maybe, of how far he'd fallen, how completely he'd been outmaneuvered by everyone, including the wife he'd discarded, how the empire he'd built was being held together by the woman he'd publicly humiliated while his own judgment had almost destroyed everything. Do it. His voice was barely a whisper. You handle it. All of it. The treaty, the executions, the rebuilding. I'll support whatever you decide. It wasn't abdication, not formally, but it was close enough. Transfer of practical authority from the king to the queen in front of witnesses who would spread this story through every noble house by nightfall. And Serafina accepted it the way she'd accepted everything else tonight. As necessity. As the only option that led to survival instead of extinction. She turned to Kael. Take the Morcant family into custody. Full security. No visitors. No communication with outside. They stay alive until trial, but comfortable isn't a priority. Kael smiled. Vicious. Said satisfied. My queen. Emphasis on the title again, making it formal, making it recognized. His soldiers moved on Celine and her brothers. Met resistance. Brief. Brutal. One of the brothers tried to fight and went down hard with a sword through his shoulder. Not dead, but no longer a threat. The others learned fast and surrendered. Celine looked at Serafina as they dragged her toward the doors, and her expression was pure hatred. You think you've won. You think stopping this changes anything. My family has been planning for 2 centuries. We have contingencies, resources, people positioned throughout the empire who'll continue the work even with us gone. Probably true. Serafina nodded acknowledgement, which is why I'm going to spend the next year rooting out every single person you placed, every corrupted official, every bought general, every noble house that took your money and compromised themselves. I'm going to dismantle your network piece by piece and make examples of everyone involved. Not because I'm cruel, because it's necessary, because corruption that deep doesn't get negotiated with. It gets burned out. Celine laughed, genuine amusement despite the circumstances. You're just like us, ruthless, willing to do whatever it takes. The only difference is you have a crown and better public relations. No. Serafina's voice was quiet, deadly. The difference is I'm doing this to save something. You were doing it to feed your family's ego and settle grudges from 200 years ago. Motivation matters, even when the methods are ugly. They took Celine away, her brothers, the warriors who'd been loyal to her family, cleared the hall of the immediate threat while smoke still drifted in and the city outside burned and everything hung on whether Serafina could actually deliver the treaty she'd promised in the next hour. She looked at the assembled nobles, some loyal, some compromised, most just terrified and trying to figure out which way to jump to survive. Understood that this was the moment, the hinge point where empires either stabilized or collapsed completely. Every house that accepted Morcant money, that signed contracts, or made agreements, or took any benefit from their network. You have 24 hours to confess and provide documentation. Full disclosure, names, amounts, services rendered. Do it voluntarily and you'll face fines and sanctions, but you'll keep your lands and titles. Wait for us to find you and I'll consider it continued treason. Punishment escalates accordingly. She let that sink in. Let them understand she was offering one chance, one narrow window to come clean before the purge started in earnest. This empire nearly died tonight because good people stayed silent and bad people coordinated. That ends now. You want to survive what comes next? You prove loyalty through action, through truth, through being willing to burn your own bridges and hand me the evidence I need to clean this rot out permanently. Lord Corvin stepped forward, the Northern House leader who'd been gathering evidence, who'd risked everything to help. I'll testify, provide every document, every communication, everything they offered and how they approached it. Others followed, slowly, reluctantly, but they came. Nobles who'd been compromised and were choosing confession over the alternative. Not all of them, not even most, but enough to start building the case that would dismantle Celine's network. Serafina watched them come forward and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just cold understanding that this was how power actually worked. Fear and incentive, threat and opportunity. The appearance of choice where really there was only survival or destruction. Margot appeared with writing materials, the old lady moving fast despite her age, already anticipating what Serafina needed. They set up a table, pulled maps, started drafting the treaty that would save the capital from burning. Serafina worked with 3 northern lords who knew the disputed territories, argued over border coordinates and trade percentages and settlement rights, negotiated with herself essentially because there was no time for proper counsel or debate. Just her making decisions that would affect millions of lives based on incomplete information and desperation. Darius watched from the dais, didn't interfere, didn't contribute, just stood there like a ghost in his own palace while his wife rewrote the Empire's external relationships on the fly. 30 minutes in, Kael returned. "My queen, we have a problem. The dungeons are full. We arrested everyone on the Morcant network we could identify, but we're running out of secure space." Shantian. "Execute the ones who held military positions." Serafina didn't look up from the treaty. Anyone with command authority who was actively participating in the coup. They're not confused nobles who took money. They're enemy combatants who opened the gates. Treat them accordingly. Kael hesitated. That's 60 people, maybe more. Then it's 60 executions. She met his eyes. And I want it done publicly, before dawn. So when the city wakes up tomorrow, they understand that treason has consequences, and this government is still functional, still capable of defending itself. It was brutal. Excessive, maybe. The kind of mass execution that would be debated by historians and philosophers for generations. But Serafina had learned something in the past weeks. Mercy was a luxury purchased with stability. And right now, stability costs blood. Kael nodded, withdrew. And Serafina went back to the treaty, finished the border coordinates. Trade percentages that favored the Empire slightly, but not enough to be insulting. Settlement rights in zones that were already disputed and mostly worthless for anything except legitimacy. Everything structured to give Kira what she'd actually wanted while costing the Empire resources it could afford to lose. She signed it, had 3 northern lords witness, had a priest invoke the goddess as additional weight. Then she walked it outside herself, through the broken doors, across the courtyard, to where Kira waited with her army still holding position but not advancing. The Eastern Alpha took the document, read it carefully, had her own people read it, consulted with advisors in low voices while Serafina stood there unarmed and exposed, trusting that the treaty was valuable enough to keep her alive. The Kira was smart enough to recognize a genuine offer versus another trap. Finally, Kira looked up. "This is acceptable. We'll withdraw at dawn, and I'll hold you to every word of this. If you break faith, we come back. And next time we don't negotiate." "I won't break faith," Serafina said it simply. "You have my word as queen, as alpha of this empire. The treaty stands." They shook on it, warrior to warrior, leader to leader. And Kira smiled, almost friendly. "You're a better king than the one wearing the crown. Empire might actually survive if you're the one running it." Then she gestured and her forces began withdrawing. Professional, orderly, taking their victory in treaty form instead of blood and burning. The kind of outcome everyone said was impossible when dealing with Eastern clans, but here it was, happening because someone was willing to negotiate instead of just defaulting to violence. Serafina watched them go, felt nothing. No relief, no triumph, just exhaustion and the knowledge that tonight was just the beginning, that rebuilding what Selene had broken would take years, that her relationship with Darius was destroyed beyond any repair, that the nobility would never fully trust her again after watching her seize power in front of witnesses. But the empire would survive, and that was enough. She walked back inside, found the hall mostly empty. Nobles fled to their estates or locked themselves in rooms to wait out the purge. Darius still on the dais, staring at nothing. Margot waiting with a list of urgent matters that couldn't wait for morning. The executions happened before dawn like Seraphina ordered. 63 people who'd held military command and actively participated in opening the city to invasion. She watched them die, made herself witness the cost of her orders, refused to hide behind subordinates or necessary evil. If she was going to rule through blood and fear, she'd at least do it with eyes open. The city woke to bodies hanging from the palace walls and proclamations about treason and conspiracy. Woke to news that the eastern invasion had been turned back through negotiation, that the queen had saved them while the king stood paralyzed, that power had shifted and everyone needed to recalibrate their understanding of who actually ruled the empire. Seraphina didn't sleep. Spent the hours after dawn processing confessions from compromised nobles, building organizational charts of Selene's network, identifying who needed to be removed and who could be salvaged with proper oversight. The work was endless, brutal, but it was work she knew how to do, had been doing for years while Darius played conqueror and ignored the infrastructure that made conquest sustainable. 3 days after the ceremony, she met with him. Private audience. First time they'd been alone since everything collapsed. He looked older, tired, broken in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. "I'm stepping down," he said it without preamble. Formally. "At the next assembly. You'll be crowned ruling monarch, not consort. Actual sovereign authority." Seraphina nodded, had expected this, had already started planning for the transition. "Why?" "Because you were right." Darius's voice was hollow. "About everything. I was compromised, incompetent. I let obsession override judgment and it nearly destroyed what we built. What you built. Because I'm starting to understand that most of the empire's success was your work, my reputation, my legend, but your competence holding it together. That's not entirely true." She said it honestly. "You built something. The military victories were real. The vision of unified territories was yours. I just handled the boring parts, the logistics and politics and relationship management that turned conquest into civilization. And I ignored you, dismissed you, publicly humiliated you, then refused to listen when you tried to warn me." Darius finally met her eyes. "I destroyed our partnership, our marriage, almost destroyed the empire, because I needed to be worshipped more than I needed to be effective." He stood, moved to the window, looked out over the capital, still recovering from invasion and internal purge. "I'll accept exile. Southern frontier. Somewhere far enough that I'm not a complicating factor. You'll have full authority to rebuild, to root out corruption, to establish whatever government structure actually works. And maybe in a few years, historians will be kind enough to remember the early victories and forget how it ended." Seraphina felt something twist in her chest. Not forgiveness, not love. Just recognition of shared history. Of 10 years where they'd actually been partners before it all fell apart, before betrayal and obsession and mutual destruction became the defining characteristics. "You don't have to exile yourself," she said it quietly. "You could stay. Work under my authority instead of your own. Help rebuild what we both broke." "No." Darius shook his head. "I can't serve under you. Not because of pride, because my presence undermines your authority. Nobles will always wonder if I'm influencing your decisions. Whether you're truly independent or just a puppet, you need clean separation. Need everyone to understand this is your empire now, not ours, yours." He turned back to face her. "And you need to understand something. I loved you. Really. Before Selene, before everything went wrong. What we had was real. And I destroyed it because I couldn't separate ego from leadership. Couldn't accept that questioning my judgment wasn't betrayal. That partnership meant actually listening instead of just expecting agreement." "I know." Seraphina's voice was soft. "And I loved you. probably still do in whatever broken way you keep loving someone after they've shattered everything. But love isn't enough. Never was. We needed respect, trust, honesty, and we lost all of that somewhere between conquest and corruption. She stood, crossed to him, stood close enough to see the lines around his eyes, the exhaustion, the genuine remorse that might have mattered if it had come sooner. Go then, take exile if that's what you need. I won't stop you, won't even formalize it as punishment, just let you leave quietly and tell the histories you wanted space to reflect, give you that much dignity. Thank you. He reached for her hand, stopped himself. Let it drop. For what it's worth, you're going to be an extraordinary ruler, better than I ever was. The Empire is lucky to have you, even if I was too stupid to recognize it. Then he left. Walked out of her chambers and her life with the kind of quiet finality that felt more permanent than any dramatic exit. And Serafina stood alone in the silence afterward, feeling nothing. Empty. Hollowed out by weeks of crisis and betrayal and desperate survival. But empty was better than broken. And she still had work to do. The trial of Celine Morcan and her family took 6 weeks to prepare. Serafina wanted it thorough. Wanted evidence so overwhelming that even sympathetic nobles couldn't deny the conspiracy. Brought forward testimony from northern houses, financial experts who traced the stolen millions, military commanders who documented how border defenses had been deliberately weakened, letters in Celine's own hand discussing assassination and timing and acceptable casualties. The court convened in the Great Hall, same space where the blood moon ceremony had nearly ended in complete disaster. Symbolic. Intentional. Serafina presided as acting monarch while Darius's formal abdication processed through legal channels. Wore the crown. Held the authority. Made sure everyone understood the shift had already happened regardless of what ceremonies came later. Celine stood in chains, still beautiful even after weeks in prison, still defiant, her family beside her. Brothers and father and uncles who'd spent decades planning revenge and resurrection, all of them facing execution, and they knew it. The trial was formality, public theater to legitimize what was already decided. But Serafina made them go through it anyway, made witnesses testify, made evidence mount piece by piece, made Celine and her family stand there and hear exactly how their conspiracy had been documented and dismantled. Made it clear to every noble watching that this was justice, not just political convenience. Celine was allowed to speak in her own defense, used it to deliver a speech about Southern nobility's right to rule, about how the Morcant family had been unjustly stripped of power and everything they'd done was reclaiming stolen inheritance, about how Serafina and Darius represented northern brutality and suppression of legitimate aristocratic rights. It was eloquent, passionate, complete fiction, and it landed with exactly nobody because the evidence was too overwhelming and the threat too recent. Nobles who might have been sympathetic to aristocratic restoration weren't willing to defend collaboration with foreign invaders and mass theft. The line between political grievance and treason was too clear. The verdict was unanimous. Death for Celine and her adult family members. Prison for the younger ones who could argue they'd been following orders without full knowledge. Serafina delivered it herself. Voice steady, eyes meeting Celine's across the hall, giving her that much. Acknowledging the enemy who'd come closer to winning than anyone else. Any last words? The formal question, required by law. Celine smiled. One last time, that beautiful, vicious smile. You're going to regret this. Not killing me. You should. But showing mercy to the younger generation. They'll remember what you did to their family. And someday, when you're old and think you're secure, they'll come for you the same way we came for your husband. Patient. Careful, waiting until you can't see them coming. Probably. Serafina acknowledged it calmly. But that's a problem for future me. Right now I'm solving present problems. And you're the biggest one. The executions happened at dawn, public, witnessed by thousands. Serafina made herself watch again, made herself carry the weight of ordering deaths, even when they were legally justified and strategically necessary. Refused to become the kind of ruler who killed from a distance and pretended it wasn't violence. Celine died last. Walked to the block with head high. Dignity in the face of death that almost made her sympathetic. Almost. Then Serafina remembered the letters, the casual discussion of acceptable casualties, The plan to murder Darius in front of witnesses and her in private, the millions stolen while people starved, and she felt nothing when the blade fell, just relief that this particular threat was over. The coronation happened 2 months later. Formal transfer of power from king to queen. Darius attended, stood in the crowd with other nobles, and watched Seraphina crowned as Luna Empress. New title, new authority. Not consort, not partner. Sole sovereign ruler of an empire she'd saved through desperation and brutality, and refusal to break when everything said she should. Kael Draven became her Lord Commander, highest military authority below the Empress herself. Exiled commanders returned to positions of honor. Northern houses that had risked everything to help were rewarded with trade benefits and political influence. Every person who'd stood with Seraphina during the crisis found themselves elevated. Every person who'd hesitated or hidden or tried to play both sides found themselves demoted or removed. The purge took 8 months, rooting out Celine's network, identifying corrupted officials, restructuring the treasury and military and civilian government to prevent similar infiltration. It was exhausting, brutal, necessary. And it worked. Slowly. Painfully. The empire stabilized. Border rebellions ended when their funding dried up. Tax revenue returned to normal levels. The machinery of government started functioning again. But Seraphina never forgot what it cost. The executions, the purges, the moment she'd chosen survival over mercy and burned through legal niceties to save an empire that was actively dying. The moment she'd become exactly what Celine accused her of being, ruthless, willing to do whatever it took. The only difference being motivation and what she chose to build afterward. A year after the Blood Moon ceremony, Seraphina stood in the same hall during another ceremony. This time, celebrating peace. The Eastern Treaty was holding. Trade was flowing. Settlement rights had been honored. Kira Ashenfang attended as honored guest and alliance partner. The kind of thing that would have been impossible under Darius, but worked because Seraphina had proven she kept her word even when it cost her. Kael found her during a quiet moment, away from the crowds and celebration. You did it. His voice held respect. Admiration, maybe. Saved the empire. Rebuilt stronger. Proved that showing mercy to enemies can work when you're smart about it. I didn't show mercy, Seraphina corrected him quietly. I showed strategy. Offered Kira something better than continued conflict. And I executed 63 people to make sure everyone understood betrayal had consequences. That's not mercy. That's calculated use of violence and negotiation to achieve stability. Close enough, Kael smiled. That broken smile that had become familiar. And for what it's worth, you're a better ruler than the histories will probably acknowledge, because the histories will focus on the executions and the drama, not on the boring, competent governance that made everything else possible. As long as the empire survives, I don't care what the histories say. Seraphina meant it, had learned that caring about legacy was just another form of ego, another trap that led to prioritizing reputation over function. She looked out over the celebration. Nobles from a dozen territories mixing and trading and negotiating, Eastern warriors drinking with Northern houses, the kind of integration and cooperation that only happened when someone was willing to enforce it through combination of threat and opportunity, when someone cared more about outcomes than being loved. Far to the south, Darius lived in exile. She received occasional reports. He was quiet, kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. Maybe he'd found peace. Maybe just defeat. Seraphina didn't know, and had stopped trying to care. He was past. History. The man she'd loved, and the partnership they'd built, both casualties of choices that couldn't be unmade. What mattered was forward. Building something that would outlast her, that would survive the next crisis and the one after that, that would prove you could forge empire through competence and strategy instead of just conquest and charisma. Months turned to years. The empire grew stronger, richer, more stable. Seraphina ruled with combination of calculated mercy and ruthless enforcement that kept both allies and enemies constantly recalibrating. Never quite sure whether she'd negotiate or execute. Never comfortable enough to plot against her. Always aware that the woman who'd survived Celine's conspiracy and turned an invasion into alliance treaty was more dangerous than she looked. And she remembered. Every person who'd helped. Every person who'd hesitated, Every choice made in desperation that had carved her into something colder and harder and more effective than the woman who'd stood at that lunar banquet, believing partnership and love were enough. Betrayal hadn't just destroyed her marriage. It had transformed her into exactly what the Empire needed. A ruler who understood that survival at the top meant being willing to sacrifice everything, everything except the Empire itself, and living with the weight of those sacrifices because the alternative was extinction. That night, alone in her chambers after the celebration ended, Serafina looked at herself in the mirror. Saw the Luna Empress. Saw the scars that didn't show. Saw the woman who'd learned that power wasn't given, wasn't earned through virtue or righteousness, was taken, held, defended through whatever means proved necessary. And she smiled. Not the diplomatic mask, not the public face, just honest acknowledgement of what she'd become, who she'd had to be, what it cost, and whether it was worth it. The Empire was stable. Her enemies were dead or exiled or too afraid to move against her. The future looked brighter than it had in years, and all it took was burning away every soft part of herself, every mercy, every hesitation, every belief that being good mattered more than being effective. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new desperate choices. But tonight she could rest knowing she'd survived what should have killed her, that she'd transformed attempted murder into coronation, that the woman Darius discarded had become the ruler he never could be. And somewhere in the southern frontier, the fallen king lived with his choices, while the woman he'd betrayed ruled the empire he'd almost destroyed. That seemed like justice enough. The first sign came 3 years into her reign. A letter, unsigned, delivered to her private chambers through channels that should have been impossible to penetrate. Serafina found it on her desk one morning between budget reports and diplomatic correspondence. Plain paper, simple handwriting, words that made her blood ice over. You killed my sister. You think you won. You didn't. We're still here, still watching. And when you've forgotten to be afraid, we'll remind you what family means. Serafina read it twice, checked the seal on her door. Intact. Questioned her guards. None had seen anyone enter. Margot hadn't delivered it. No servant claimed responsibility, which meant someone inside her security apparatus, inside the network of trusted people she'd built over 3 years of careful vetting, had placed it there. Someone close enough to reach her personal space. Someone patient enough to wait years before making contact. She called Kyle, showed him the letter without commentary, watched his expression shift from curiosity to cold assessment. He knew what this meant, what it represented. The threat Celine had promised from the execution block wasn't theoretical anymore. How many of Celine's younger relatives did we spare? His voice was clinical, already running calculations. 17. Serafina had the number memorized, ages ranging from 12 to 22 at the time of the trial. Too young to have been primary conspirators, old enough to remember. We placed them under house arrest, stripped titles and lands, but allowed them to live. I thought mercy would buy loyalty eventually, or at least neutralize the threat. You thought wrong. Kyle studied the letter. This handwriting, educated, confident, someone who's had time to grow up, to plan, to build their own network while we were busy congratulating ourselves on stability. Find them. Serafina's voice was flat. All 17. I want locations, activities, associates, everything. And I want to know which one wrote this before the weekends. The investigation took 4 days. What they found was worse than a single vengeful relative. It was an organization, carefully constructed over 3 years. The surviving Morcant youth hadn't just accepted their reduced circumstances. They'd used them, played the role of chastened nobility while quietly building alliances with every house that had been punished during the purge, every family that lost status or wealth or members, every noble who smiled at court and harbored resentment underneath. They called themselves the Restoration, not subtle, not trying to be, a deliberate echo of their family's original goal with the added weight of martyrdom. Celine hadn't just been executed for treason in their version of history. She'd been murdered by a jealous queen who couldn't accept being replaced. The conspiracy had been fabricated, the evidence forged, the trial a sham designed to eliminate political rivals and consolidate power. It was complete fiction, but it was compelling fiction, the kind that gave disaffected nobles something to rally around, a cause, A narrative where they were victims of tyranny instead of participants in a system that had nearly collapsed. Cale's people identified the letter writer, Elena Morcant, Celine's youngest sister. 16 when Celine died, 19 now. Smart, charismatic, dangerous in the way only true believers are dangerous. She'd spent 3 years building this network while living under supervised restriction in a northern estate, using visitors and servants and the kind of slow patient recruitment that was invisible until you looked for patterns. 43 noble houses were involved, some peripherally, others deeply committed, all of them connected through Elena and her core group of Morcant survivors, all of them waiting for the right moment to move against Serafina, to destabilize the empire enough that restoration looked like salvation instead of rebellion. Serafina reviewed the intelligence in her study, names and faces and conspiracy charts that showed just how badly she'd miscalculated. Mercy hadn't bought loyalty. It had created enemies with time and motivation to organize, with legitimate grievance they could weaponize, with the patience to wait until she'd grown comfortable. We have to arrest them. Cale was certain, all of them, before they move from planning to action, before this becomes another coup attempt, and prove their narrative correct. Serafina countered. Prove that I execute anyone who threatens my power, that I can't tolerate dissent or opposition, that everything they're saying about tyranny and fabricated charges is true. It is true. Cale said it bluntly. You do execute threats. You did fabricate some of the evidence against lesser conspirators to make the purge more comprehensive. And you absolutely don't tolerate opposition when it threatens stability. The difference is you do it to preserve the empire. They want to tear it down. But the methods are similar enough that mass arrests play directly into their propaganda. Serafina was quiet, thinking through scenarios. If she moved against them, she validated their claims. If she didn't, they'd eventually move against her with more preparation and better timing. There was no clean option, no choice that didn't cost something vital. What if we co-opt them instead? She said it slowly, testing the idea. Bring Elena into the government, give her a position with real authority, make the restoration part of the system instead of opposition to it. You want to reward conspiracy with power. Cale's voice carried disbelief. Put the woman who just threatened you in a position to do actual damage. I want to neutralize the threat by removing the motivation. Serafina was working it out as she spoke. Their whole narrative is based on being oppressed, excluded from power they believe is rightfully theirs. What if I give them power? Publicly acknowledge past injustices, offer partnership instead of continued punishment, steal their cause by addressing it. That's insane and risky and might actually work. Cale studied her. You're betting that giving them what they want removes the incentive to destroy you to get it. I'm betting that most of them want power more than revenge. That Elena is smart enough to recognize opportunity when offered. That integrating them is less dangerous than fighting them. Serafina met his eyes. And I'm betting that if I'm wrong, we'll see it coming and can still arrest them later. But if I'm right, we solve this without more executions and purges that make me look exactly like the tyrant they claim I am. It was calculated risk, the kind that had defined her reign. Serafina sent the invitation herself. Personal letter to Elena requesting private meeting. No threats, no accusations. Just acknowledgement that they needed to talk and preference for doing it civilly before other options became necessary. Elena arrived a week later, escorted by guards but not prisoner, dressed well but not ostentatiously, playing the role of minor nobility with perfect pitch. She was beautiful, not like Celine, different, sharper, more austere, the kind of beauty that came with intelligence and control rather than raw magnetism. She sat across from Serafina in the same study where so many critical decisions had been made, accepted tea with steady hands, waited for the Empress to speak first with patience that suggested she'd been trained for exactly this kind of encounter. You wrote me a letter. Serafina opened directly. Threatened me. Admitted to conspiracy. Then accepted my invitation to meet privately. I'm curious whether that's courage or stupidity. Strategy. Elena's voice was calm, clear. You can't arrest me without proving I'm right about your tyranny. And you can't ignore me without looking weak. So you invited me here to negotiate, to see if there's a way forward that doesn't involve more bloodshed. I accepted because I want the same thing. Do you? Serafina studied her. Because your letter suggested otherwise. Suggested you want revenge for your sister, want to destroy what I've built, want restoration of your family's position regardless of cost. I want acknowledgement. Elena set her teacup down. Acknowledgement that my sister was executed based on evidence that was partially fabricated, that your purge swept up innocent people along with the guilty, that this empire was built on northern conquest and southern subjugation, and we're tired of pretending that's noble instead of brutal. Your sister planned to murder the king. Serafina's voice stayed level. Stole millions. Invited foreign invasion. These aren't disputed facts. They're documented reality. And the 43 houses currently under sanction, Elena countered. Were they all active conspirators? Or did some of them just take money from my family without understanding the larger plan? Did you execute people who might have been saved with proper investigation? Did you prioritize speed over justice because you needed to project strength? Yes, Serafina admitted it calmly. I did all of that because the empire was collapsing, because showing mercy to potential threats meant risking another coup, because I chose stability over perfect justice, and I'd make the same choice again. At least you're honest. Elena's expression shifted, something like respect flickering through. Most rulers lie about it. Pretend their purges were all righteous and necessary. You just admit you sacrificed people to preserve power. I sacrificed people to preserve the empire, Serafina corrected. There's a difference. Power is meaningless. What matters is whether the territories are stable, whether people are fed, whether the systems function. I don't care about my legacy or reputation. I care about outcomes. And sometimes outcomes require ugly choices. They sat in silence. Two women from opposite sides of conflict that had defined the past years. Two survivors of betrayal and conspiracy who understood power in ways comfortable people never would. Two chess players recognizing another master across the board. What are you offering? Elena asked finally. Because you didn't invite me here to debate philosophy. You want something. Integration. Serafina laid it out simply. You and the core Morcant survivors get positions in government. Real positions with authority and oversight. You get to participate in ruling instead of plotting against it. In exchange, the restoration dissolves. Your network stands down. We move forward as partners instead of enemies. And the houses currently under sanction, reviewed individually. Some will be restored fully, others partially. A few might stay restricted if evidence suggests continued threat. But we evaluate fairly instead of collectively punishing everyone associated with your family. Why? Elena's voice carried genuine confusion. Why offer this? You could arrest us all, execute the leaders, break the network through force. Why negotiate? Because I'm tired of killing people. Serafina said it quietly, honestly. Because 3 years of executions and purges and constant vigilance has made this empire stable, but it hasn't made it better. Because I want to build something that doesn't require permanent oppression to maintain. And because you're right, some of the people I punished were innocent, and I'd rather correct that than defend it. Elena studied her, long enough that Serafina felt the weight of that assessment, understood she was being evaluated for sincerity, for trustworthiness, for whether this offer was genuine partnership or elaborate trap. I'll need guarantees, Elena said finally. Formal agreements. Not just your word. Legal protections that prevent you from executing us the moment we're no longer useful. Done. Serafina had anticipated this, had documents already prepared, contracts and treaties, and the kind of binding legal framework that limited her own power. That made betraying this agreement costly enough that it wasn't a viable option. They spent the next 3 hours negotiating details. Elena was good, sharp, understood power dynamics and legal loopholes and where vulnerabilities existed in proposed structures, pushed back on terms that gave Serafina too much unilateral authority, insisted on oversight and review processes and the kind of checks that actually meant something. It was exhausting, frustrating, necessary, and by the end they had agreement. Not perfect, not everything either side wanted, but workable, real, the kind of compromise that suggested both parties were actually committed to making it function. Elena left with signed documents and promised to dissolve the restoration within the month. Serafina watched her go and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, maybe. Or just relief that this particular crisis had been resolved through negotiation instead of violence? Kale found her an hour later, still in her study, staring at the contract she'd just signed. "You look uncertain. That's concerning." "I just gave power to people who want me dead." Serafina said it flatly. "Put them inside the government where they can do actual damage if this goes wrong. Either I'm a genius or I just committed elaborate suicide. Time will tell." Kale sat across from her. "But for what it's worth, I think you made the right choice, not the safe choice, but the right one. Building something sustainable means including opposition instead of just crushing it." The announcement came a week later. Public ceremony in the Great Hall. Serafina formally acknowledged historical injustices in the Purge, offered restoration of titles and lands to houses that could demonstrate innocence or minimal involvement, appointed Elena Morcant as Minister of Southern Affairs, with authority over resource allocation and regional governance. The reaction was explosive. Half the nobility thought Serafina had gone mad. The other half cautiously approved. Elena's network dissolved as promised, but many members transitioned into legitimate government roles. The restoration became the Southern Coalition, still organized, still representing specific interests, but working within the system instead of against it. And for 2 years it worked. The empire stabilized further. Southern territories that had been restive under northern rule became more cooperative under regional governance. Elena proved competent, effective, a genuine partner who disagreed with Serafina on policy but implemented decisions once made and contributed meaningfully to debate. Serafina started to believe she'd actually solved it, that integration had worked where suppression would have failed, that the risk had been worth it. Then the eastern border exploded. The attack came without warning. Not from Kira's territories. They were holding to treaty obligations and had become reliable trading partners. This was deeper east. Clans that had never negotiated, never participated in any agreement, wild packs that lived by raiding and considered civilization weakness. They hit 3 border settlements simultaneously, burned them, took prisoners, disappeared back into the wastes before Imperial forces could respond. Classic raiding pattern, except the scale was wrong. Too coordinated, too well supplied. Someone had funded this, equipped them, pointed them at specific targets. Serafina called War Council, her generals, her advisors, Elena, Kyle, everyone who needed to be involved in military response. They gathered in the strategy room with maps and intelligence reports and grim understanding that this wasn't random violence. This was attack, deliberate, planned. Who benefits? Serafina asked the room. Who gains from destabilizing the eastern border right now? Silence. Everyone thinking, running calculations. Then Elena spoke, quietly, carefully, with the tone of someone delivering bad news they wished wasn't true. The northern houses. They've been losing influence since you empowered southern governance. Trade routes shifted, resources redirected. They're not suffering, but they're not dominant anymore. And dominance matters to people who've held it for generations. You're saying my own northern allies are funding raids against imperial territory. Serafina kept her voice neutral. Didn't let the anger show yet. Wanted facts before emotion. I'm saying someone with significant resources and knowledge of border defenses coordinated this. Someone who understands imperial military deployment well enough to hit where we're weakest. Someone who might want to create crisis that requires your attention and resources. That makes southern governance look unstable. That shifts power back north. Serafina looked at Kyle. He nodded slowly. It fits the pattern. Lord Corvin and the other northern houses have been quiet lately. Too quiet. They supported you during the coup, but they've been losing economic advantage since. If they wanted to reverse that without openly rebelling. Create external threat that justifies militarization and northern resource allocation. Serafina finished the thought. Make it look like Eastern policy is failing, so I have to pivot back to northern priorities. It was elegant, vicious, exactly the kind of strategy she'd use herself if positions were reversed. And it meant the people she'd trusted most, the ones who'd risked everything to help her survive Celine's conspiracy, were now undermining her because their interests had shifted. Betrayal didn't feel like anything anymore. Serafina had been betrayed too many times to register shock. Just cold calculation about what it meant and how to respond. The question was whether she could prove it before acting, whether evidence existed, or if this was just informed suspicion. I need intelligence, hard evidence connecting northern houses to eastern clans, financial transfers, communication records, weapons shipments, anything concrete. That's going to take time, Kale warned. And while we investigate, those clans are still raiding, still killing Imperial citizens. We need military response regardless of who funded it. Deploy forces to defend the border. Serafina made the call. But don't pursue deep into Eastern territory. I want defensive posture only. No escalation. That might be exactly what whoever organized this wants. She tasked her intelligence network with the investigation. The same people who'd helped expose Celine. The same apparatus that had kept her alive through 3 years of conspiracy and threat. And she waited, kept governing, kept projecting stability while underneath everything she was preparing for the possibility that her most trusted allies were actively working against her. The evidence came 6 weeks later. Not from her intelligence people. From Elena. The southern minister appeared in Serafina's chambers late one night, alone, carrying documents that shouldn't have been in her possession. Where did you get those? Serafina recognized the seal. Northern House correspondence. Private. Secured. I still have contacts. Elena said it simply. People who owe loyalty to my family, who feed me information because they remember who we used to be. They found this and brought it to me because they thought I should know. Why bring it to me? Serafina took the documents, started reading. Why not use it yourself? Leverage it for Southern advantage. Because I agreed to partnership. Elena's voice was steady. Because you trusted me when you had every reason not to. Because if we're going to make this work, it has to be actual cooperation, not just waiting for opportunities to backstab each other. The documents were damning. Letters between Lord Corvin and 2 other northern houses discussing funding for eastern clans, coordinating timing with seasonal trade disruptions, planning how to use the crisis to argue for shifting resources back north. Everything Serafina had suspected, everything she'd hoped wasn't true. And at the bottom, a line that made her stop breathing for a moment. Once the Empress is sufficiently weakened, we move to restoration. Not Morcant, proper northern rule. The kind that understands strength instead of this southern pandering compromise she's built. They weren't just undermining her policy. They were planning coup. The people she'd trusted most, the ones who'd helped her survive, who'd been rewarded with influence and authority. They'd decided she was no longer useful, that her vision of inclusive governance was weakness, that they wanted the empire returned to northern dominance under different leadership. How many are involved? Serafina's voice came out hollow. How deep does this go? At least 8 major houses, probably more peripherally. Elena sat across from her. They've been building this for over a year, since you appointed me, since you started redistributing power more equitably. They see it as betrayal, as you abandoning the people who saved you to curry favor with former enemies. She wasn't wrong. That's exactly how northern houses would see integration. A Serafina choosing politics over loyalty, choosing southern votes over northern blood. Never mind that it was working, that the empire was more stable than it had been in decades. Strength looked like northern military dominance. Anything else was compromise, weakness, betrayal. What do you recommend? Serafina asked it genuinely. Wanted Elena's assessment, wanted perspective from someone who understood factional politics from the other side. Arrest them. Elena said it without hesitation. All of them. Before they're ready to move. You have evidence now, use it. Eliminate the threat the same way you eliminated my sister's conspiracy, and validate everything they believe about me. That I execute anyone who disagrees, that I can't tolerate opposition, that I'm tyrant who uses law as weapon against political enemies. You are. Elena said it bluntly, kindly almost. You're a tyrant, a competent one who's built something good, but you maintain power through force and fear and willingness to kill threats. Pretending otherwise just makes you an ineffective tyrant. Own what you are and use it. Serafina looked at her. This woman whose sister she'd executed, whose family she'd destroyed, who was now advising her to execute more people. The world had become so twisted that former enemies were more trustworthy than old allies, that the person with most reason to hate her was the one offering honest counsel. If I arrest them, the North fractures. Serafina thought through consequences. Other houses take sides, maybe rebel, Maybe just withdraw support. Either way, I'm fighting internal conflict while defending against external threat. If you don't arrest them, they coup you when ready, Elena countered. Kill you. Install puppet leader. Undo everything you've built, including Southern integration, including the stability that's actually working. You die, and we all go back to the cycle of conquest and oppression. Both options were catastrophic. Both led to some version of empire collapse or civil war. And Serafina was so tired of making impossible choices, of being forced to choose between bad and worse, of surviving through brutality and calculation when what she wanted was just one moment of being able to build without someone trying to tear it down. There's a third option. She said it slowly, thinking it through. I go to them, confront them directly, with evidence. Give them choice. Stand down and face investigation but not automatic execution, or continue plotting and face full military response. That's suicide. Elena's voice carried genuine concern. They'll kill you the moment you're in their territory. Use the confrontation to eliminate you and claim self-defense. Maybe. Serafina smiled. No humor in it. But maybe not. Maybe they're rational enough to recognize that killing me makes them traitors beyond redemption. That their best chance is negotiating some kind of settlement. And maybe I'm done making decisions from safety while other people die because of my choices. This is about Darius. Elena said it quietly. About guilt. You think you failed him. Failed to see the threat in time. And now you're trying to avoid repeating that mistake by giving these houses chance to explain before you act. This is about breaking the cycle, Serafina corrected. About stopping the endless pattern of betrayal and purge and new conspiracy. About trying something that might actually resolve conflict instead of just suppressing it until it metastasizes somewhere else. It was insane. Kyle said so explicitly when she told him the plan. Walking into hostile territory with evidence of their treason and hoping they'd negotiate instead of kill her was beyond risky. It was borderline suicidal. But Serafina was committed, saw it as the only way forward that didn't involve more executions and purges and proving everyone right who said she was tyrant. She rode north with minimal guard. 10 soldiers. Elena, Kyle, enough to show she wasn't completely reckless, but few enough to make clear this was diplomatic mission, not invasion. The journey took 4 days through territories that had been loyal, that she'd trusted, that had helped her build this empire and were now planning to tear it down. Lord Corvin received her in his great hall, same place where they'd met years ago, where he'd pledged loyalty and helped expose Celine. He looked older, harder, less like the young lord who'd risked everything to help and more like someone who'd been calculating cost-benefit for months. My Empress. The title was correct, the tone was wrong, somewhere between respectful and mocking. This is unexpected. We weren't prepared for state visit. This isn't state visit. Serafina pulled out the documents, threw them on his table. This is reckoning. You funded Eastern raids, coordinated attacks on Imperial territory, planned coup, and you did it while pretending loyalty, while sitting on my council, while benefiting from position I gave you. Corvin read the letters, didn't deny them, looked up with expression that was pure calculation. And what are you going to do about it? Execute me like you did Celine. Prove that anyone who questions your judgment ends up dead. I'm giving you choice. Serafina's voice stayed level. Stand down. Dissolve this conspiracy. Submit to investigation and accept consequences, or continue and face military response. Not arrest. Not execution. Open war between North and Crown. That's not choice. That's ultimatum. Another lord spoke up. One of Corvin's co-conspirators. You come here with evidence acquired through spying and demand we surrender or die. Call it whatever you want, but it's tyranny. You attacked Imperial citizens. Serafina's patience was eroding, funded raids that killed people under my protection, planned to overthrow the government. Those aren't political disagreements, they're crimes. And yes, I'm demanding you face consequences. That's not tyranny, that's law. Your law. Corvin stood, came around the table. We helped you survive Celine, risked our houses, our lives. And you repaid us by giving power to Southern nobles, by redistributing Northern resources, by building government that treats our enemies like equals. We didn't save you so you could betray everything we fought for. I didn't betray anything. Serafina held her ground. I built something sustainable, something that doesn't require permanent military dominance to maintain. You wanted me to be northern puppet, to consolidate power for your benefit. And when I refused, when I actually tried to govern fairly, you decided I was enemy. You are enemy. Corvin's voice dropped. Cold. Final. You stopped being one of us the moment you chose Southern integration over Northern loyalty, and we're not going to let you destroy what generations built just because you think fairness matters more than strength. Then we're at war, Serafina said it calmly, accepting what had become inevitable. You're in rebellion against the crown. I'll return to the capital, mobilize forces, and we'll settle this through combat since you refused negotiation. She turned to leave, made it 3 steps before Corvin spoke again. You're not leaving. We can't let you go back and prepare. Can't give you time to organize defense. This ends here. Guards poured into the hall. 30. 40. Corvin's personal force plus men from allied houses, all armed, all positioned to prevent escape. Serafina's 10 soldiers moved to defensive formation, but the numbers were impossible. They were surrounded, trapped, and she'd walked right into it thinking she could negotiate with people who'd already decided killing her was the solution. Kael was at her side instantly, sword drawn, Elena behind them both. The Southern minister who'd warned her, who'd tried to prevent exactly this, who was about to die because Serafina had been stupid enough to believe former allies might choose peace over power. Stand down, Corvin addressed Serafina's guards. You're outnumbered, outpositioned. This doesn't have to be massacre. Surrender and you'll be treated well. Kept comfortable until new government establishes itself. Fight and you die here. Some of her guards looked at each other, calculating. They were professional soldiers, understood when odds were impossible. Serafina couldn't blame them for considering surrender, couldn't ask them to die for her mistakes. But Kael didn't hesitate, didn't lower his weapon, just positioned himself between Serafina and the approaching guards with the kind of absolute loyalty that made her chest tighten. We don't surrender, his voice carried to every corner of the hall. We're sworn to the Empress. That oath doesn't break because you outnumber us. Then you die loyal. Corvin gestured and his guards advanced. Everything happened fast. Steel meeting steel, shouting, blood. Serafina's guards fought with desperate skill, but numbers mattered. They went down one by one. Kael held longer, fought like the commander he'd always been. Took 3 enemies with him before a blade found his shoulder. Another, his leg. He collapsed, still trying to protect her, still trying to buy seconds she didn't know how to use. Elena grabbed Serafina's arm, pulled her toward a side exit. We have to run. Now. Before they secure the perimeter. They made it to the corridor, heard pursuit behind them, guards shouting, boots on stone. The sounds of hunt with nowhere to hide. The northern estates weren't her territory. She didn't know the passages, didn't have allies here, was running blind through hostile ground while wounded soldiers died buying time she couldn't capitalize on. They rounded a corner and stopped. More guards ahead, behind, trapped between forces with no escape route. Elena pushed Serafina behind her, drew a knife from somewhere, prepared to fight with the kind of fierce determination that said she meant every word about partnership, about choosing cooperation over revenge. And Serafina understood. This was the end. This was where every choice led, where trying to build something better than endless cycle of violence resulted in death at hands of people she'd trusted most, where mercy and integration and belief in negotiation got you killed in a hallway by former allies who decided you were obstacle instead of leader. She'd survived Seleni's conspiracy, survived invasion, survived 3 years of threats and plots, and she was going to die here, in Northern Territory, betrayed by the same people who'd once saved her, proving that trust was always mistake, that partnership was illusion, that the only thing that mattered was power and willingness to use it without hesitation or conscience. Corvin appeared, walked through his guards until he stood before her, face grim, resolved, looking at her like she was already dead. I'm sorry it came to this. He said it genuinely. We did respect you once, did believe in what we were building, but you changed, became something we couldn't support, something that valued fairness over strength, peace over dominance, and we can't let that destroy our legacy. Serafina met his eyes, didn't flinch, didn't beg, just looked at him with the cold understanding that she'd been right all along, That building empire through competence and cooperation was always going to fail because people like Corvin couldn't conceive of power that didn't flow from violence. Do it then. Her voice was steady. Kill me. Install your puppet. Tear down everything we built. And watch the empire collapse anyway because you have no idea how to actually govern, how to maintain alliances or manage resources or do anything except conquer and dominate. We'll manage. Corvin raised his hand, gestured to the guards. Do it quick. She deserves that much. The guards moved forward. Serafina closed her eyes, felt Elena tense beside her, heard steel leaving scabbards, and prepared for the end that had always been coming since the moment she'd chosen to survive instead of dying quietly when Darius betrayed her. Then the world exploded. Not metaphorically, actual explosion. Stone and fire and concussive force that threw everyone to the ground. Serafina's ears rang. Her vision blurred. Dust and smoke filled the corridor, making it impossible to see or breathe or understand what was happening. Hands grabbed her, pulled her up, dragged her through the chaos. She fought on instinct. Until Elena's voice cut through the ringing. It's us. Don't fight. We're getting you out. Us. Not just Elena. Other voices. Other hands. Soldiers who shouldn't be here. Who couldn't be here. Serafina tried to focus. Tried to see through the smoke. And caught glimpses of uniforms she recognized. Southern Coalition forces. Elena's people. The ones who were supposed to be nowhere near Northern territory. They moved fast. Through the breach the explosion had created. Out into the courtyard, horses waiting. More Southern soldiers holding perimeter. Fighting Corvin's guards. Creating corridor for escape that Serafina didn't understand but wasn't going to question. Elena boosted her onto a horse. Mounted behind her. Spurred toward the gates while combat raged around them. And Serafina looked back once. Saw Corvin standing in the destroyed corridor, saw the fury on his face, the understanding that she'd escaped, that his carefully planned execution had failed because someone he hadn't accounted for had been prepared for exactly this scenario. They rode hard, put distance between themselves and the estate before Corvin could organize pursuit, changed horses twice, used routes that avoided main roads, and finally stopped in a secured location that Elena's people had prepared. Safe house. Hidden. Far enough from immediate threat that Serafina could finally breathe. Finally think. Finally understand what had just happened. You planned this. She looked at Elena. Accusation and gratitude mixed together. You knew they'd try to kill me. That's why you brought forces without telling me. I knew you'd go anyway. Elena said it simply. Knew you'd try to negotiate because that's who you are. Someone who believes talking can solve everything. So I made sure someone was ready when talking failed, and they tried to murder you instead. Serafina should have been angry. Was angry. About being manipulated. About Elena making decisions without her knowledge. About being saved by someone who'd seen her weakness clearly enough to protect her from it. But mostly, she was alive. When she should have been dead. When her choices had led directly to execution corridor, and only Elena's preparation had prevented it. Thank you. She said it quietly. Meant it. I was wrong. About negotiation. About thinking I could resolve this peacefully. You weren't wrong to try. Elena sat beside her. You were wrong to go alone. To think you could do it without backup plan. Without accepting that some people can't be negotiated with. That some conflicts only end one way. And now. Serafina looked at her. What happens now? I just survived assassination attempt by half the northern nobility. My most trusted allies tried to kill me. The empire is fractured, and I'm hiding in southern safe house while my enemies organize. Now you stop pretending you're not what you are. Elena's voice was hard. Practical. You're Empress. That means making the choices no one else can make. Doing the things that are necessary even when they're ugly. You tried mercy. You tried integration. You tried every gentle option, and they tried to murder you for it. She leaned forward, held Serafina's gaze. So now you do what you should have done from the beginning. You become what they're afraid of, what they accused you of being. You become the kind of ruler who doesn't give second chances, who doesn't negotiate with traitors, who understands that some threats only respond to overwhelming force. Serafina felt something shift inside her chest. The last piece of who she'd been burning away. She'd tried to be fair, tried to be inclusive, tried to build something better than the cycle of violence and betrayal that had defined this empire for generations. and it had almost gotten her killed, had gotten loyal soldiers killed, had proven that mercy was just another word for weakness when dealing with people who only understood power. What are you suggesting? She already knew the answer, wanted to hear Elena say it. Total war. Elena said it without hesitation. Against every northern house that participated. We mobilize southern forces, we march north, we burn the estates, execute the lords, scatter the families, make examples so complete that no one ever questions your authority again. No trials, no investigations, no mercy. Just absolute elimination of the threat. That makes me exactly what they said I was. Serafina heard her voice coming from somewhere far away. Tyrant, monster, someone who kills anyone who opposes her. Yes. Elena smiled. Cold. Hard. The expression of someone who understood power in its rawest form. It makes you survivor. And in this world, that's the only thing that matters. Love doesn't keep you alive. Fairness doesn't protect you. Only fear. Only the absolute certainty that crossing you means death. Not for you, for your family, your house, your legacy, everything. Serafina looked at her hands, saw them shaking, not from fear, from rage, from the realization that every attempt to be better, to break the cycle, to build something sustainable had led here, to hiding while enemies organized, to loyal people dead, to the complete failure of every ideal she'd tried to maintain. And she made choice, not because it was right, not because it would lead to a better world, because it was the only option left that led to survival, that protected people who'd risked everything for her, that prevented the empire from dissolving into another cycle of conquest and collapse. She looked at Elena, saw recognition there, saw someone who understood exactly what was about to happen, what Serafina was about to become, and saw approval. Grim satisfaction that the Empress was finally becoming what she needed to be instead of what she wished she could be. Mobilize the southern forces. Serafina's voice came out cold, flat, empty of everything except purpose. Every house, every soldier, everything we can field. We march north in 3 days, and we don't stop until every traitor is dead and their houses are ash, and everyone in this empire understands that betraying the crown has one consequence: extinction. The Southern Army marched north under blood-red banners that Serafina had designed specifically for this campaign. Not the imperial colors, not the traditional symbols of unity and prosperity, just red. The color of what was coming, the color of what she'd become. No subtlety, no pretense, just honest declaration that mercy had died in that corridor and what replaced it didn't negotiate. Elena rode beside her at the head of 15,000 soldiers. Southern forces that had been quietly mobilizing for months in case integration failed, in case the empire fractured along the exact lines it was fracturing now. She'd planned for this. The southern minister who Serafina had trusted with power had been preparing for war the entire time, not because she wanted it, because she understood that building new systems meant having force ready when old powers rejected change. How long have you been ready for this? Serafina asked it without accusation. Just curiosity about how thoroughly she'd been managed. Since you appointed me. Elena's voice was matter of fact. I told the southern houses to prepare, to train, to stockpile weapons and supplies. Not because I wanted war with the North, because I knew they'd never accept us as equals, that eventually they'd move to reclaim dominance. And I wanted us ready when that happened. Smart. Serafina meant it. Wished she'd been that smart, that she'd prepared for betrayal instead of hoping competence would prevent it. But that was past. What mattered was present. The army at her back. The targets ahead. The absolute certainty that she was done trying to save people who wanted her dead. They reached the first northern estate on the 4th day. House Brennan. Minor nobility who'd participated in Corvin's conspiracy but weren't primary leaders. Serafina gave them one chance. Sent messenger under peace banner, demanded surrender, offered trial and potential mercy if they came out peacefully. They refused. Sent the messenger back with missing tongue and message that the North would never bow to Southern whore playing Empress. Serafina ordered the assault without hesitation. Her forces surrounded the estate, breached the walls, fought through defenders who were brave but not prepared for professional military operating with coordination and superior numbers. It took 6 hours. By the end, The estate was burning. Lord Brennan was dead. His sons were dead. The women and children were given exactly 1 hour to gather belongings before being expelled with nothing except the clothes they wore. No trials, no investigation, no careful consideration of individual guilt, just elimination of the threat and scattering of the survivors. The kind of brutal efficiency that sent message to every other northern house watching. That showed what was coming if they continued resistance. Word spread faster than the army moved. Houses ahead started evacuating. Some fled to Corvin's stronghold seeking protection. Others tried negotiating, sent envoys claiming they'd been coerced, that they hadn't really supported conspiracy, that they'd surrender completely if Serafina would guarantee safety. She guaranteed nothing, told them they could surrender and face judgment after the war ended, or they could fight and die now. No promises about outcome, no reassurance about mercy, just honest statement that she was no longer in the business of making people comfortable about consequences. Some surrendered, those she placed under guard and moved to secure locations for later processing. Others fortified their positions and prepared for siege, those she bypassed, left minimal forces to contain them, and kept moving toward the real target, toward Corvin and the core conspirators who'd actually planned and executed assassination attempt. The march took 3 weeks, not because of distance, because Serafina was being methodical, surgical, taking time to secure territory as she advanced so no enemies remained behind her lines, establishing supply chains and communication networks and all the infrastructure that separated professional campaign from just angry mobs seeking revenge. She'd learned from Darius's campaigns, from watching him conquer territories through combination of speed and overwhelming force. But she'd also learned from his mistakes, from seeing how unconsolidated conquest led to rebellion and instability. She wasn't just destroying northern power, she was replacing it, installing southern administrators, redistributing land to families who'd proven loyalty, building new order from the ashes of the old. Elena watched her work with something like admiration. You're not just fighting war, you're conducting social revolution, permanently shifting power from north to south. I'm doing what's necessary. Serafina studied maps in her command tent, marked positions and supply routes and objectives. The North had dominance for too long. Used it to suppress and exploit. That ends now. We're rebuilding the empire on foundation that doesn't require northern military supremacy to function. And if they resist, if other houses join Corvin, if this becomes protracted civil war that tears the empire apart, then it tears apart. Serafina looked up, met Elena's eyes. I tried the gentle approach, tried integration and compromise and building consensus, and they tried to murder me. So now we do it the hard way. Either they accept new order or they die. No middle ground, no room for continued resistance. The statement was absolute, final. And Serafina meant every word. She'd crossed threshold somewhere between survival and this moment, had become the thing Celine accused her of being, the thing Corvin feared, the ruthless calculation dressed in legitimacy who would burn the empire to bedrock before allowing threats to persist. Cale found her that night, recovered from his wounds, angry at having been left behind during initial assault, but mobile enough now to rejoin. He limped into her tent with the kind of barely contained fury that said he had opinions about recent strategy. You're making mistakes. He didn't bother with preamble. Burning estates, scattering families, operating like conqueror instead of sovereign. You're creating generational enemies. People whose children will grow up hating you the same way Celine's family did. Good. Serafina didn't look up from her maps. Let them hate me. Let them spend generations plotting revenge, as long as they're too afraid to act. As long as they understand that moving against the crown means extinction. I can live with being hated, can't live with being weak. This isn't strength. Kael's voice carried disappointment. This is rage. You're angry about the betrayal and you're taking it out on everyone with northern blood. That's not strategy. That's just violence. You're right. Serafina finally met his eyes. I am angry, furious. The people I trusted most tried to kill me, and I'm done pretending that makes me the bad person. They're the ones who chose violence, who rejected every peaceful option, who decided murder was preferable to accepting equitable governance. So yes, I'm burning their estates, scattering their families, making examples so complete that the next generation grows up understanding exactly what happens when you betray the crown. And when does it stop? Kale demanded. When do you decide you've killed enough, destroyed enough? When does the Empress I helped put on that throne, remember, she's supposed to be building something instead of just burning it down? When they surrender. Seraphina's voice went cold. When Corvin and every house that participated kneels and begs for mercy they don't deserve. When the North collectively understands that their time of dominance is over and new order is permanent. Then I stop. Not before. Kale studied her. Long silence. Then he nodded slowly. All right. You want to be conqueror. Be conqueror. But don't pretend this is justice. Don't dress it up as necessary response to threat. Call it what it is. Revenge. Punishment. The Empress who survived becoming the thing that almost destroyed her. He left before she could respond. Left her alone with maps and reports and the weight of choices that felt inevitable, even though some part of her knew he was right. That she'd crossed line from defense into aggression. From justice into vengeance. That burning estates and scattering families made her exactly what Corvin had accused her of being. But that part was small. Quiet. Easily ignored under the roar of purpose and the absolute certainty that she was tired of being the one who tried to be better, while everyone else chose violence. They reached Corvin's stronghold on the 5th week. Massive fortification built on strategic high ground. Walls 30 feet high, garrison of 2,000 soldiers. Supplies to withstand siege for months. He'd prepared. Used the time Seraphina spent securing territory to consolidate forces and build defensive position that would be costly to assault. She studied it from distance, calculated angles and approaches, and what taking it would cost. 1,000 dead minimum, maybe 2. Hard fighting through prepared defenses against enemies who knew they were fighting for survival. The kind of battle that Darius would have loved. Direct assault against fortified position relying on superior numbers and willingness to accept casualties. But Seraphina wasn't Darius. And she'd learned from Selene that the best victories came from making enemies destroy themselves. She sent messenger, not demanding surrender, demanding conversation, private meeting with Corvin, just the two of them. Neutral ground between armies, no weapons, no guards, just talk. Corvin agreed, probably because he was curious, possibly because he thought he could kill her there and end the war with single blade. Either way, he showed up on schedule at the designated location. Hilltop midway between positions, open enough that both armies could observe, private enough for actual conversation. He looked older, tired, carrying weight of choices that had led here, but his eyes were still hard, still certain, still convinced he was right. You came. He said it with something like respect. Thought you'd just besiege me, starve us out, avoid direct confrontation. I wanted to see you. Seraphina stood across from him, 10 feet of grass between them. Close enough to talk, far enough to react if he tried anything, wanted to understand why. Why betray someone who'd only ever tried to build something that benefited everyone? Because you stopped building for everyone. Corvin's voice was calm, factual. You started building for the South, redistributing northern resources, empowering houses that fought against us during unification, treating former enemies like equals when they'd earned nothing except defeat. They earned citizenship, participation, the same rights any territory has once integrated into the empire. Seraphina kept her voice level. You wanted me to maintain northern supremacy permanently, to govern like conqueror instead of sovereign, to keep the South subjugated because that's comfortable for you, because that's what works. Corvin stepped closer. Strength works. Military dominance works. Everything else is just pretty philosophy that collapses the moment pressure increases. You built empire on northern military power, then tried to pretend that power didn't matter, that governance could replace conquest. And you're about to learn why that's naive. Am I? Seraphina smiled. No humor in it, because from where I stand, you're the one trapped in fortress while I control the countryside. You're the one isolated and surrounded while I've consolidated southern support and broken northern coalition. Your strategy was assassination because you knew you couldn't beat me politically or militarily. And that failed. So now what? You wait in there until supplies run out, until your allies realize you're losing and abandon you, until you're alone and desperate, and I come through those walls. We'll see. Corvin's voice carried confidence she didn't understand. We'll see who's desperate when winter comes. When your southern forces discover fighting in northern climate is different than training in temperate regions. When supply lines stretched across hostile territory start failing. When you realize besieging strongholds costs more than burning undefended estates. I didn't come here to debate strategy, Serafina said it quietly. I came to offer terms. Last chance. Surrender. Face trial. Accept punishment for treason and preserve your house. Your family won't be scattered. Your children won't grow up exiled and broken. Just you and the primary conspirators pay the price. And you? Corvin asked. What do you get out of offering mercy now after burning your way north? Precedent. Serafina answered honestly. Proof that surrender is option. That I'm not just monster seeking destruction. That there's path forward for houses willing to accept new order. You're the test case. Take the deal and others might follow. Refuse and I make example of you that ensures no one else tries. I'd rather die. Corvin said it simply. Then live in empire ruled by someone who thinks southern merchants deserve same voice as northern warriors, who believes fairness matters more than strength, who's forgotten that civilization is thin veneer over violence, and the only thing keeping it intact is people willing to enforce order. Then you'll die. Serafina accepted it. But not quickly, not heroically in battle. I'm going to starve you, break your garrison through attrition and winter and despair. And when you finally emerge because you're eating corpses to survive, I'm going to execute you slowly in front of what's left of your forces. Make it so terrible that the history remembers exactly what happens to people who betray me. Corvin smiled, almost proud. There she is, the real empress, the one who'll do whatever it takes. The tyrant we always knew was hiding under the diplomatic mask, not hiding anymore. Serafina turned to leave. See you in spring, if you last that long. The siege began that afternoon. Serafina's forces surrounded the stronghold, cut supply lines, established blockade that prevented anyone from entering or leaving, set up winter camps with the kind of infrastructure that said they were prepared for long engagement, and waited. Let time do the work. Let supplies dwindle and morale crack and desperation set in. Occasionally they'd assault a section of wall, probe defenses, force Corvin's garrison to respond and spend resources, then pull back. No commitment to actual breach, just pressure. Constant grinding pressure that wore defenders down without costing attackers much. Winter came hard. Northern winters always did. Snow and ice and temperatures that killed unprepared soldiers. But Serafina's forces were ready. Southern troops equipped with northern gear, supplied through networks she'd established during the advance. Warm, fed, relatively comfortable considering circumstances. Inside the fortress, conditions were different. Intelligence from deserters reported food running low, garrison on half rations, disease spreading through crowded conditions, Corvin maintaining control through force and charisma, but cracks forming. Some wanted to surrender, others wanted desperate breakout attempt. Most just wanted it to end whatever direction that took. 3 months into siege, Corvin tried negotiation, sent messenger requesting new terms, offering partial surrender. He'd step down, but his house would maintain titles and lands. His family would be spared, some kind of compromise that let him save face while ending siege. Serafina refused, sent messenger back with simple response. Full surrender or nothing. The offer from the hilltop was gone. Now the only option was complete submission followed by public execution. No negotiation, no middle ground. Corvin's response came at dawn. Full garrison assault. Every soldier he had left pouring out of gates in desperate attempt to break siege. Suicide charge motivated by starvation and despair and the understanding that dying in battle was preferable to surrendering for slow execution. They hit Serafina's lines with everything. 3,000 soldiers against 15,000, but concentrated at single point. Trying to punch through, create corridor, escape into the countryside and scatter before being hunted down. It was brave, desperate, doomed. Serafina's forces absorbed the charge, gave ground strategically, funneled attackers into kill zones where superior numbers and positioning meant massacre. Corvin's troops fought with the kind of ferocity that comes from having nothing left to lose, but ferocity without strategy just meant dying harder. The battle lasted 4 hours. By the end, 2/3 of Corvin's garrison was dead. The survivors were scattered, running for lives through winter countryside being hunted by cavalry. No organization, No leadership, just individual desperation. Serafina rode through the aftermath. Bodies everywhere, snow-stained red. Dying men begging for mercy she didn't give. Wounded being sorted into those who might survive and those who wouldn't. The efficient, brutal calculus of battlefield medicine where resources determined who lived. She found Corvin near the gates, wounded but alive, surrounded by her soldiers who'd captured him during the retreat. He looked at her with something between hatred and resignation, knowing what came next, knowing he'd failed completely. Take him, she told her guards. Clean him up, keep him alive. I want him healthy for the execution. They dragged him away. Serafina watched without emotion, felt nothing except cold satisfaction that this particular threat was neutralized, that Corvin would pay publicly for betrayal, that every northern house watching would understand exactly what happened to people who chose rebellion. The execution was scheduled for 3 days later. Time to gather witnesses, to spread word throughout the territories, to make sure everyone who needed to see this saw it. Nobles from both north and south, common people, soldiers, everyone assembled in the captured fortress courtyard to witness justice. Corvin was brought out in chains, cleaned like Serafina ordered, looking almost noble except for the metal restraints and complete absence of hope. He didn't beg, didn't plead, just stood there waiting for end with the kind of dignity that almost made him sympathetic. Serafina read the charges: treason, conspiracy, attempted regicide, funding raids that killed imperial citizens, each one documented, proven, undeniable even to sympathetic observers. Then she pronounced sentence: death, immediate, public, no final words or chances for redemption. The executioner stepped forward, raised blade, and Serafina felt nothing. Watched the steel fall, watched Corvin's head separate from body, watched blood spray across stone while witnesses stood silent, some approving, some horrified, all understanding the message. This is what happens. She spoke to the assembled crowd, to every noble and soldier and common person watching. This is the cost of betrayal, of choosing violence over cooperation, of rejecting legitimate governance because it doesn't serve personal interest. Lord Corvin had chance to surrender, chance to accept justice through trial. He chose war. This is war's outcome. She gestured to the body. Let it stay there. Let everyone see. Let the image spread throughout the empire. And let every ambitious house understand that I don't make empty threats, that testing the crown's authority ends exactly here, in blood and disgrace and permanent elimination. The crowd dispersed, quiet, subdued, carrying the memory of what they'd witnessed, spreading word that the empress who'd tried integration and mercy had transformed into something else, something harder, something that enforced order through fear and overwhelming response to threat. Elena found her afterward, in the Fortress Solar that used to be Corvin's command center, now repurposed as temporary headquarters for Southern administration. You did it, her voice carried satisfaction, broke Northern resistance, proved your authority, established precedent that rebellion ends in execution. Did I? Serafina looked out the window at countryside she'd conquered, at estates burning in distance where other conspirators were being rooted out, at empire held together through violence and fear. Is this victory? Or just proof that Corvin was right, that civilization is just violence with better public relations? It's survival. Elena said it simply. You're alive. Your enemies are dead. The empire is intact. Everything else is philosophy for people with luxury of safety. And the cost? Serafina's voice was quiet. The soldiers who died taking this fortress, the families scattered, the children who'll grow up hating me, the transformation from sovereign trying to build something better into tyrant who maintains power through executions. Necessary cost. Elena came to stand beside her. You want to know the truth, the real truth about power? It's this. The person willing to pay the highest cost wins, always. Corvin wouldn't execute his own people to maintain siege. You would. That's why you won. Not because you're better or more righteous, because you're willing to sacrifice more. That's bleak. Serafina meant it, felt the weight of that perspective settling into her bones, felt herself accepting it because the alternative was admitting the past months had been mistake. That transformation into this version of herself was tragedy instead of necessity. It's honest, Elena corrected. And honesty is all that matters at this level. You can lie to the public, can dress this up as justice or necessary response to threat. But don't lie to yourself. Don't pretend you're still the woman who tried to negotiate in that corridor. You're what survival made you, what betrayal forged, and you're more effective this way, even if you're less comfortable. Serafina wanted to argue, wanted to claim some part of her old self remained, that mercy and fairness still mattered somewhere beneath the Empress who'd burned estates and executed conspirators without trial. But she couldn't find the words, couldn't locate that part of herself anymore. It had died somewhere between assassination attempt and siege, between offering terms and watching them rejected, between being the one who tried to be better and becoming the one who simply refused to lose. The consolidation took 6 more months, hunting down scattered conspirators, replacing Northern administration with Southern appointees, redistributing land and resources, building new power structure that permanently shifted balance away from Northern military dominance toward Southern economic and administrative control. Some Northern houses surrendered, accepted new order, were allowed to maintain positions if diminished. Others fled, scattered to Eastern territories or beyond imperial borders entirely, became exiles and refugees carrying stories about the tyrant empress who destroyed anyone opposing her vision. Serafina processed it all mechanically, made decisions without emotion, approved executions and redistributions and administrative appointments with the kind of cold efficiency that made her effective but left her hollow. She was winning, rebuilding empire on more stable foundation, proving that Southern governance could replace Northern conquest. But the cost kept accumulating, not just in bodies and burned estates, in pieces of herself that kept breaking off. Empathy, hesitation, the ability to see enemies as people instead of just threats requiring elimination. Everything that made her human outside the role of empress. Kyle noticed, confronted her one night in the fortress she'd claimed as new Northern headquarters. "You're losing yourself." He said it quietly, without judgment, just observation. The woman who cared about justice, about building something better. She's gone. What's left is just efficient mechanism for maintaining power. Good. Serafina didn't look up from reports. That woman almost got me killed, got loyal soldiers killed, got the empire fractured. This version keeps us alive, keeps the territory stable, achieves outcomes even if the methods are ugly. And when there are no more threats, Kyle pressed, when you've eliminated everyone who might oppose you, when the empire is secure and you don't need to be this anymore, can you go back? Can you find the person you used to be? Serafina was silent, long enough that the question hung heavy, because she didn't know the answer, didn't know if transformation was reversible, if becoming tyrant to survive meant being tyrant forever, if there was any path back to the woman who'd believed in fairness and mercy and building consensus. "I don't know." She admitted it quietly, "And I don't know if it matters. The empire needs what I am now, not what I was. Maybe that's enough. Maybe being effective is better than being good when good gets you killed. That's what tyrants always say." Kale's voice carried sadness. Right before they become monsters, everyone eventually has to overthrow. He left her alone with that thought, with the understanding that she might be building an empire that would eventually need to destroy her to survive. That transformation into this effective, brutal version of herself might be creating future threat, that the cycle she was trying to break might just be resetting with her as next villain. But that was future problem. Present required dealing with one more threat, one more piece of unfinished business that had been waiting since the beginning. Darius, still in Southern exile, still alive, still technically former king with claim to legitimacy. Still potential rallying point for anyone wanting to challenge her authority. She'd left him alone out of sentiment, out of belief that he'd stay quiet and irrelevant, but intelligence reported he'd been contacted. Northern refugees reaching out, offering support if he'd return. Claim the throne from the woman they called usurper and tyrant. Restore proper order. He'd refused so far, stayed in exile. Maintained silence. But the offers kept coming, and eventually desperation or ambition or just boredom might make him accept, might make him relevant again, might create legitimacy crisis she couldn't afford. Elena brought the intelligence personally, laid it out with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything. He's a threat, potential rallying point. You need to eliminate him before someone decides former king is preferable to current empress. He's in exile. Serafina said it weakly, staying quiet, not causing problems. For now, Elena countered. But how long before that changes, before he decides he wants power back, before someone convinces him you're destroying everything he built and he needs to save it? You left him alive out of sentiment. That was a mistake. Fix it. You want me to execute my former husband. Serafina heard her voice coming from somewhere distant. The man I loved, who I built empire alongside. Just kill him because he might become threat. I want you to survive. Elena's voice was hard. And survival means eliminating everyone who could challenge legitimacy. Darius is that. He'll always be that. As long as he's alive, you're vulnerable. So handle it. Send assassins. Make it look like accident. Whatever. Just remove the threat permanently. Serafina knew she was right. Knew Darius alive was liability. Knew leaving him breathing was sentiment she couldn't afford. Knew the logical choice. The strategic choice. The choice the empress she'd become would make without hesitation. But she couldn't say it. Couldn't give the order. Some last piece of who she'd been was holding on. Refusing this final transformation. Refusing to become person who murdered former partner out of pure calculation. I'll think about it, she said finally. Knowing it was weakness. Knowing Elena saw it as weakness. But unable to cross that particular line. Not yet. Elena nodded. Disappointed, but not surprised, left Serafina alone with the choice, with the understanding that eventually she'd have to make it, that Darius couldn't stay in limbo forever. That being effective empress meant handling every threat no matter how personal. 2 weeks later, the decision was made for her. Darius left exile, appeared in the Eastern Territories, announced he was reclaiming the throne, declared Serafina's reign illegitimate, called for loyal houses to support restoration of proper order. He'd finally accepted. Finally decided that watching from exile while she transformed empire was too painful, that he needed to act, to try reclaiming what he'd lost, to prove he was still relevant. And Serafina felt something break inside her chest. Not grief, not betrayal. She'd used up those emotions, just cold understanding that sentiment had been weakness, that leaving him alive had been mistake. That now she'd have to kill him, not as preemptive move, but as response to active rebellion. The final lesson in why mercy was luxury she couldn't afford. She mobilized forces immediately, diverted troops from consolidation efforts, prepared for campaign against Darius and whoever supported him. It wouldn't be many. He'd lost credibility, lost authority, lost everything except name and memories of former glory. But names mattered. Memory mattered. And if she let him live, let him organize even small resistance, it would metastasize, would give every disaffected house something to rally around, would create permanent division. So she marched east, with army hardened from northern campaign, with reputation for absolute ruthlessness, with singular purpose. End this, end Darius, end every last threat to stability, even if it meant killing the man she'd once loved. Elena rode beside her. Kael commanded the vanguard, Southern and Northern forces unified under single banner. Single purpose. Single leader who'd proven she'd do whatever necessary to maintain power. They met Darius's forces 3 weeks later, small army, maybe 3,000. Houses that still believed in him, that wanted old order back, that rejected everything Serafina had built, led by the former king wearing crown he'd given up, trying to reclaim glory through force when he'd lost it through weakness. Serafina's forces outnumbered them 5-1. The outcome wasn't in question, just the cost, just whether Darius would surrender or force massacre. She sent messenger, one final time, offering terms. Stand down, return to exile. Live quietly, and she'd let him breathe. Keep fighting, and she'd kill everyone. Him, his supporters, anyone who'd believed restoration was possible. Darius sent messenger back, with simple response. Come and take it. And Serafina smiled, cold, hard, the expression of someone who'd stopped being human and become something else, something that survived, something that won, something that would haunt the histories as either savior or monster depending on who wrote them. She gave the order. Her army advanced. Battle began. And somewhere in the chaos of steel and blood and dying men, Serafina prepared to do the one thing she'd sworn she'd never do. Kill the man who'd made her empress through his betrayal, the man whose destruction had forged her into this. The last piece of her former life that needed eliminating before transformation was complete. The armies crashed together like storm waves meeting shore. And in the center of it all, two former partners prepared to end what they'd started. To finish the story that had begun with love and empire and ended here. In blood and finality and the absolute understanding that only one of them would leave this field alive. The battlefield was smaller than Serafina expected. Not the vast open plain where armies could maneuver and strategy mattered. Just a narrow valley between hills where 3,000 desperate soldiers faced 15,000 professional ones. Where Darius had chosen to make his stand not because the terrain favored him, but because he'd run out of places to retreat. She watched from elevated position as her forces deployed. Systematic. Professional. The kind of organized violence that came from experienced commanders executing practiced maneuvers. No chaos, no uncertainty, just efficient application of superior numbers and training against enemies who were brave but outmatched. Darius's banner flew in the center, Black Wolf on silver field, the symbol that had unified territories and built empire. Now reduced to rallying point for 3,000 soldiers who believed restoration was possible, who thought former glory could be reclaimed through force of will and nostalgia for better days. Elena positioned her southern forces on the left flank. Kale commanded the right. Serafina held the center with her personal guard. The plan was simple: envelope them, cut off retreat, force surrender or annihilation. Standard tactics for superior force against inferior one. But something felt wrong. Serafina couldn't identify it. Just instinct developed over years of survival and conflict. Some detail that didn't fit. Some piece of the situation that suggested this was more complicated than numerical advantage indicated. "He's baiting us." Kael rode up beside her, studied the enemy formation. "This position is terrible defensively. No escape routes, no strategic advantage. Either Darius has gotten stupid or he wants us to attack. Why would he want that?" Elena joined them. "He can't win. Even if we take casualties, the outcome isn't in doubt. What does he gain from forcing engagement in position that guarantees his death? Legitimacy." Serafina saw it suddenly. Understanding clicking into place. He's not trying to win militarily, he's trying to win symbolically. Former king making heroic last stand against tyrannical empress. Dying nobly in battle instead of executed as traitor. Giving his supporters martyr instead of failure. "So we don't attack." Elena said it logically. "We besiege. Starve them. Force surrender without giving him the heroic death that serves his narrative. And prove we're afraid to face him directly," Serafina countered. "Prove that for all our superior numbers and position, we still won't risk confrontation. That validates everything he's saying about us being tyrants who hide behind overwhelming force instead of legitimate authority." She studied the field, calculated costs and benefits, strategic versus symbolic victories, the choice between being smart and being right, between winning efficiently and winning in a way that mattered beyond immediate tactical outcome. "We attack." She made the decision, but not full assault, controlled engagement. "We accept his challenge, but on our terms. I'll meet him. Single combat. Former king versus current empress. Winner takes legitimacy. Loser gets history's judgment." "That's insane." Kael's voice carried genuine alarm. "You're risking everything on personal duel. If you lose, if he kills you, this entire campaign collapses. The empire fractures. Everything you've built falls apart. And if I refuse, I prove I'm afraid of him, that my authority comes from armies instead of right, that deep down I know his claim is stronger." Serafina met Kael's eyes. "I've spent 3 years becoming what survival required, doing whatever was necessary. Now I need to prove it wasn't just cruelty, wasn't just power-seeking, that I actually believe the empire is better under my rule, enough to stake everything on it. This is about guilt." Elena said it quietly. "About Darius. About wanting to face him yourself instead of hiding behind soldiers. That's not strategy. That's personal need." "Maybe." Serafina acknowledged it. "But personal and strategic align here. I win. I prove authority derives from more than just violence. I lose. Someone better takes over. Either way, the question gets answered." She sent messenger before they could argue further. Proposed the duel. Single combat. No interference. Winner claimed throne and empire. Loser accepted defeat permanently. Darius accepted immediately. Of course he did. This was what he wanted. Chance to reclaim glory through personal prowess instead of political maneuvering. Chance to prove the better warrior deserved to rule. Chance to undo years of humiliation and failure through single moment of triumph. They met in the space between armies, open ground where both forces could observe, witnesses to whatever happened next. Seraphina wore light armor, mobility over protection, carried the sword Kael had given her years ago. Simple blade. Good steel. Waited for someone her size. Darius wore full armor, crown on his head, looking every bit the king he used to be. The conqueror who'd unified territories through combination of tactical brilliance and personal combat prowess. Age had slowed him slightly, but experience compensated, and desperation made dangerous opponents. They faced each other across 20 feet of grass. Two people who'd loved once, who'd built empire together, who'd destroyed each other through betrayal and obsession and choices that seemed inevitable in hindsight but had felt uncertain at the time. Seraphina. His voice carried across the distance. Same voice that had commanded armies, that had whispered promises in darkness, that had publicly crowned his mistress and shattered everything. You don't have to do this. Withdraw. Let me have the eastern territories. Divide the empire peacefully. No more bloodshed. She studied him, looking for the man she'd loved, finding only stranger wearing familiar face. Someone who'd taken their partnership and burned it for validation, who'd nearly destroyed the empire through ego and poor judgment, who was still offering compromise as if they could return to some version of before. You still don't understand. She said it quietly. Sadly, almost. This isn't about territory or power. It's about whether empires can evolve, whether rule through cooperation works better than rule through dominance, whether someone who tried to build fairly deserves to succeed over someone who only understands conquest. Philosophical nonsense. Darius drew his sword. The empire needs strength, needs leadership that doesn't apologize for using power. You've become what you needed to become to survive, but you hate yourself for it. I can see it. You've lost who you were trying to be what I made you. Maybe. Seraphina drew her own blade. But I'm still here, still standing, still holding the empire together while you're leading desperate rebellion with borrowed forces. So maybe philosophy matters less than outcomes. Maybe being effective tyrant beats being noble failure. They circled, looking for openings. Both trained fighters, but different styles. Darius fought like alpha, power and aggression, overwhelming force applied at decisive moments. Seraphina fought like survivor, defense and patience, waiting for opponent to make mistake. He struck first, fast, powerful, the kind of blow that would end fight if it connected. Seraphina dodged, barely, felt the wind of the blade passing, countered with quick cut that he blocked easily. They separated, reset, began again. The duel unfolded in moments that felt both eternal and instantaneous. Steel meeting steel, bodies moving through practiced forms, each seeking advantage through technique when strength was roughly matched. Darius was stronger, Seraphina was faster, he had reach, she had desperation. They fought across the open ground while armies watched in silence. No cheering, no encouragement, just witnessing, bearing testimony to whatever resolved here, the outcome that would define Empire's future. Seraphina felt herself falling into rhythm, muscle memory from training that had never stopped, from years of preparing for threats that kept coming. She wasn't thinking anymore, just reacting, flowing between defensive positions and occasional strikes, wearing him down, letting age and armor weight work against him. Darius started breathing harder, slowing slightly, frustration showing in increasingly aggressive attacks. He needed to win quickly. New extended fight favored younger opponent with lighter gear, started taking risks, leaving openings. Seraphina saw one, small gap when he overextended on thrust. She moved without thought, slipped inside his guard, drove her blade up under the armor, felt it punch through leather and into flesh. Not deep, not fatal, but enough to prove point, enough to draw first blood. They separated. Darius looked down at the wound, red spreading across his side. Not immediately dangerous, but painful, slowing him further, and psychological, proof she could hurt him, that this wasn't foregone conclusion in his favor. Yield. Seraphina said it without triumph, just offering option. You're wounded. This ends badly if we continue. Surrender, Accept exile, live, and watch you rule. Watch the empire I built become something unrecognizable. Watch northern dominance erode under southern influence. Darius shook his head. I'd rather die proving I was right than live knowing I failed. You already failed. Serafina's voice was gentle, almost kind. The moment you chose Celine over partnership. The moment you let obsession override judgment. The moment you stopped being the man who built this and became the man who almost destroyed it. This duel doesn't change that, doesn't redeem anything. Then let me die with dignity. Darius raised his sword again. Give me that much. They engaged again. Slower this time. Darius weakening from blood loss. Serafina could see it, could end this quickly if she pressed. But something held her back. Some last piece of sentiment, some memory of who they'd been before everything fell apart. She thought about the early years, the campaigns where they'd actually been partners, where his military brilliance combined with her political acumen had created something functional, something that worked, before power corrupted, before betrayal destroyed trust, before they became enemies instead of allies. And she realized she didn't want to kill him, didn't want this to end with his death and her standing over his corpse proving dominance through violence. That just made her everything he accused her of being, everything she'd become to survive but hated about herself. Stop. She lowered her sword, stepped back, creating distance. This is stupid. We're fighting over legitimacy when the real question is what's best for the Empire. And killing each other doesn't answer that. Darius stared at her, confused, wary. What are you doing? Offering different option. Serafina's mind raced, working through possibility forming. You want Eastern territories. Want to rule something. Fine. Take them. I'll recognize you as Eastern sovereign, independent but allied. We divide the empire but maintain cooperation. You get kingdom. I get peace. Everyone gets to move forward. That's surrender. Darius said it suspiciously. You're giving me what I demanded. Why? Because I'm tired of killing people. Serafina admitted it, honestly, exhaustedly. Because every execution and burned estate and scattered family makes me more effective and less human. Because winning through force proves nothing except I'm willing to pay higher cost. And I want to prove something else. That cooperation works better than domination even when domination is easier. She gestured to the armies watching. We can keep fighting. I'll probably win. Kill you. Destroy your supporters. Add more bodies to pile. Or we can do something revolutionary. Except that both of us have legitimate claims and different visions, and neither has to be completely wrong. This is trick. Darius's voice carried pain, physical and emotional. You're manipulating me. I'm offering you what you wanted. Serafina said it simply. Kingdom, authority, chance to prove your way works. If I'm wrong about cooperative governance, your Eastern territories will thrive and make me look foolish. If you're wrong about strength-based rule, they'll struggle and prove my point. Either way, we get answer without more death. And if I refuse, if I demand full empire or nothing, then we fight, and I kill you, and prove that might makes right and everything I've tried to build was delusion. Serafina met his eyes. Is that really what you want? To die proving the empire runs on violence? Or do you want to live proving your vision can succeed independently? Darius lowered his sword, slowly, looking at her with expression that mixed confusion and hope and suspicion. You've changed. The woman I knew wouldn't have offered this, would have pressed advantage, won decisively. The woman you knew died in that corridor when your allies tried to kill her. Serafina felt the truth of it. What's left is someone who learned that survival requires becoming what circumstances demand, but also someone who's tired of becoming worse, who wants to prove transformation was necessary response rather than inevitable corruption. She extended her hand. Not in surrender. In partnership. The thing they'd had before everything broke. Not romantic. Not even fully trusting. Just recognition that working together achieved more than destroying each other. Divide the empire. Rule our halves differently. Prove which system works better through outcomes instead of combat. That's the deal. Take it or we fight to death. Darius stared at the offered hand, long enough that Serafina thought he'd refuse. That pride or stubbornness or just commitment to original plan would override reason. Then he reached out, took her hand, shook once, firmly. The gesture that meant agreement, that meant terms accepted. The armies erupted, both sides. Confusion and relief and disbelief that duel had ended in negotiation instead of death. Commanders shouting for order. Soldiers uncertain whether to stand down or prepare for betrayal. Seraphina raised her voice, projected across the field. The empire divides peacefully. King Darius rules eastern territories as independent sovereign. I maintain west and south. We establish trade agreements and mutual defense. War ends now. Today. Anyone who continues fighting becomes enemy of both crowns. It took hours to formalize. Drawing borders, establishing terms, getting both sides to accept that conflict was actually ending without complete victory for either. Some of Darius's supporters refused, rode away rather than accept compromise. Some of Seraphina's commanders protested, wanted total victory, wanted Darius executed rather than empowered. But enough accepted. Enough understood that compromise preventing further bloodshed was preferable to victory purchased through massacre. The division happened. Treaties signed. Forces withdrew to respective territories. And the empire that had been one became two, allied, cooperative, but separate. Seraphina returned to the capital exhausted. Physically from campaign, emotionally from years of crisis and transformation and choices that had carved away pieces of herself. She'd won, secured her rule, eliminated most threats, and somehow managed to end the final conflict without adding Darius to the body count. But she didn't feel victorious, felt hollow, used up, like someone who'd survived trial by fire but lost so much in the burning that survival felt more like defeat. Elena found her in the palace gardens, late at night when court was quiet, sitting alone watching stars and thinking about cost, about price paid for empire and whether it had been worth it. You let him live. Elena said it neutrally, gave him kingdom instead of execution. The southern houses are confused. They expected total victory, expected you to prove dominance completely. I proved enough. Seraphina's voice was tired. Proved I could win if I needed to. That I'm strong enough to maintain authority, but also proved I'm not so consumed by power that I need absolute victory. That I can choose cooperation when it serves larger purpose, or you're still weak for him. Elena sat beside her, still letting sentiment override strategy, still unable to do what's necessary when it comes to Darius specifically. Maybe. Seraphina didn't deny it. But maybe that specific weakness makes me stronger ruler overall. Maybe being able to choose mercy when I don't have to proves I'm not the tyrant everyone fears. That the ruthlessness is tool rather than identity. They sat in silence. Two women who'd become unlikely partners, who'd helped each other survive conspiracies and betrayals and transformations that should have destroyed them. Who'd built something from the wreckage even if neither was entirely certain what they'd built. What happens now? Elena asked eventually. You have your empire. Your enemies are dead or exiled or ruling separate territory. You've proven you can maintain power through force and compromise. Where does Empress, who's done everything, go from here? Forward. Seraphina said it quietly, thoughtfully. I spend the next decade proving cooperation works better than domination. Building institutions that survive individual rulers, creating systems where power transfers peacefully instead of through conspiracy and violence, becoming the kind of leader who's remembered for what she built rather than who she destroyed. That's ambitious. Elena's voice carried skepticism. Also probably impossible. People are what they are. Power corrupts. Systems fail. You're one generation of competent rule at best. After you're gone, it probably collapses back into cycle of conquest and betrayal. Probably. Seraphina acknowledged it. But I have to try. Have to prove that everything I became, everything I sacrificed, wasn't just about survival, that it led somewhere, that transformation served purpose beyond just keeping me alive. She looked at Elena. And I need help. Need partners who'll challenge me when I'm wrong, who'll prevent me from becoming the thing I fought against, who'll remember the woman I was, even as I'm being the empress I have to be. Elena smiled, slight, almost unwilling. You're asking me to be your conscience, the person who keeps you honest. That's dangerous position, means telling you things you don't want to hear. I know, Seraphina meant it, but I trust you to do it. Trust you to care more about outcomes than comfort, to tell me when I'm crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed, to help me stay human while being monarch. All right. Elena extended her hand. Same gesture Seraphina had offered Darius: partnership over domination, cooperation over conquest. I'll help you build this, whatever this becomes. But first rule: you stop making decisions from guilt. Stop letting past inform present so much it paralyzes you. What's done is done. Focus on what comes next. Seraphina took her hand, felt the weight of that agreement, the beginning of something that might work, that might break the cycles she'd seen destroy so much, that might prove transformation could lead somewhere other than tragedy. The years that followed were harder than the wars. Reconstruction always was. Building systems, training administrators, establishing precedents, creating the boring infrastructure of governance that made empire function day to day. Not dramatic, not heroic, just relentless, competent work. Seraphina threw herself into it, became known as the Architect Empress, the woman who rebuilt what war had broken, who established laws limiting sovereign power, who created councils and oversight and systems designed to prevent future rulers from abusing authority the way she had. The executions haunted her. The burned estates, the families scattered. She didn't forget them, didn't pretend they were all justified. Some were necessary, others were expedient. The distinction mattered even when the bodies looked the same. She established compensation funds, restored some families, made restitution where possible, not because it fixed anything, because it acknowledged that even necessary violence left debts, that the empress who'd done terrible things in empire's name still owed something to victims of her choices. Some accepted, some refused, some hated her until they died and taught their children to hate her. Seraphina accepted that, understood she'd be villain in some histories and hero in others. That truth was complicated and she'd never be able to control narrative completely. Cale remained her military commander, loyal even when he disagreed, especially when he disagreed. The person willing to tell her when strategic thinking became cruelty, when efficiency became excuse for avoiding hard moral questions. The friend who'd seen her at worst and stayed anyway. Eastern territories under Darius developed differently, more militaristic, more hierarchical, less emphasis on integration and consensus. Some policies worked, others failed. Seraphina watched from distance, resisted urge to interfere, let him succeed or fail on own terms. They met occasionally, state visits, trade negotiations. The conversations were strange, formal, like strangers who shared traumatic history but no longer had connection beyond political necessity. The love was gone. The partnership was gone. Just remained two people who'd survived each other and were trying to prove different visions of empire. Sometimes Seraphina wondered what would have happened if he'd never betrayed her, if Celine had never existed, if they'd remained partners instead of becoming enemies, whether the empire would be stronger or weaker, whether she'd be happier or just less effective. But those were questions without answers, what-ifs that led nowhere except paralysis. She focused on what was, on the empire she'd built through blood and compromise, on the legacy she was constructing piece by piece, on proving that transformation didn't have to mean corruption, that becoming harder could still lead to building something better. 10 years after the final battle, Seraphina stood in the Great Hall during another ceremony. Not coronation, not execution, peaceful transfer of power. She was stepping down, not because she was forced, because she'd built systems where leadership could change without violence. The new empress was younger, trained by Seraphina personally, someone who'd seen both the necessity and the cost of what had been required, who understood that ruling meant serving rather than dominating, who'd been prepared to carry forward without needing to destroy everything and start over. Seraphina watched her take the crown and felt something like peace. Not happiness. The cost had been too high for happiness. But satisfaction. She'd survived. She'd built something sustainable. She'd proven that cycles could be broken with enough will and enough sacrifice. Elena stood beside her, older now, still sharp, still honest, still the person who challenged when challenging was needed. The partnership had worked. The unlikely alliance between former enemies had achieved more than either could have alone. "You did it," Elena said quietly. "Built empire that can survive you, created precedent for peaceful succession, proved cooperation works when given real commitment." "We did it," Seraphina corrected. "I couldn't have done this alone. Needed people willing to tell me truth, to challenge assumptions, to prevent me from becoming monster in pursuit of stability." "And Darius?" Elena asked. "How do you feel about him now? About how it ended?" Serafina considered, thought about the man she'd loved, the partner she'd lost, the enemy she'd faced, the separate ruler he'd become, all the versions existing simultaneously in memory and reality. I feel grateful. She said it honestly, surprised by the truth of it, because his betrayal forced me to become stronger. His weakness showed me what not to be. And ultimately, giving him separate territory to rule proved that there's more than one way to govern, that I don't have all answers. That division can work when maintained through respect rather than hostility. That's remarkably mature. Elena's voice carried amusement. The woman who burned northern estates and executed conspirators without trial has developed perspective. The woman who burned estates learned that power without restraint destroys everything eventually. Serafina smiled, slight, genuine. Including the person wielding it, I became what I needed to become to survive. But survival wasn't end goal. Building something that outlasts individual rulers was. And that required learning when to stop. When to choose cooperation over domination. When to prove strength through restraint rather than violence. She looked out over the assembled nobility. Northern and southern houses together. Former enemies coexisting. Trading. Negotiating. Participating in governance rather than constantly plotting overthrow. It wasn't perfect, tensions remained. Old grudges persisted, but it functioned. And function was foundation for everything else. Later that night, Serafina walked through the capital alone. No guards, no ceremony. Just former empress moving through streets she'd fought to control. People recognized her, some bowed respectfully. Others ignored her. Few showed hatred. Most just acknowledged she existed and moved on with their lives. That felt right. Felt like success. Not being worshipped, not being feared, just being recognized as a person who'd served and moved on, who'd done terrible things and good things and left empire marginally better than she'd found it. She ended up at the cemetery, where victims of various conspiracies and wars were buried. Celine was here. Corvin. 63 military commanders executed without trial. Hundreds of soldiers who'd died in campaigns. Thousands of people who'd been casualties of choices made in empire's name. Serafina stood among the graves and felt weight of every death, every choice, every moment where she'd chosen efficiency over mercy, strategy over compassion, survival over ethics. The debts were real. The cost was permanent. No amount of good governance afterward erased blood spilled getting there. But standing here, she understood something she hadn't before. The weight wasn't punishment. It was responsibility. The reminder that power came with cost, that leadership meant carrying burden of choices that hurt people, that being effective sometimes meant being terrible and living with consequences. She didn't pray, didn't ask forgiveness, just stood witness, acknowledged the dead, accepted that they were part of her legacy as much as peaceful succession and stable institutions, that history would judge her as complex figure who'd done necessary evil and real good and left empire transformed. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Familiar. Unexpected. Darius stood at the edge of the cemetery, older, carrying his own weight, his own regrets, looking at the graves with expression that suggested he understood exactly why she was here. I heard you stepped down. His voice was neutral, careful. They hadn't spoken privately in years, didn't have relationship beyond formal diplomatic contact, couldn't think of me without thinking of all this. The cost, the bodies, the choices that brought us here. Every ruler should visit places like this. Serafina said it quietly. Should remember that decisions have names, faces, that strategy and necessity and all the words we use to justify violence still end with people in the ground. Is that why you came? To remember? To feel guilty? To understand? Serafina corrected. To know that building empire required breaking things, people, systems, trust, and that the breaking mattered even when it was necessary, that I can be effective ruler and person who did terrible things, that both are true simultaneously. Darius nodded slowly. I think about that night, the lunar banquet, the moment I chose Celine as. Wonder what would have happened if I'd seen through her, if I'd listened to you. We'd probably be here anyway. Serafina said it without bitterness. Different path, different specific choices. But empires this size don't hold together without conflict. Without people fighting for power and control, we'd have faced crisis eventually. Question is whether we'd have faced it together or separately. And now? Darius looked at her fully. After everything. After betrayal and war and division and years of separate rule. What do you feel when you see me? Serafina considered, examined her emotions honestly, found them complex, layered, not simple hatred or lingering love, something more complicated. I feel like I'm looking at a stranger who shaped me. She said it carefully, truthfully. You're not the man I loved. I'm not the woman you married. We're what survival made us, what choices forged, and we're both carrying weight of those transformations. Neither villain nor hero, just people who did what we thought necessary and have to live with outcomes. Can you forgive me? Darius asked it quietly. For the betrayal, for Celine, for everything that came after. Serafina thought about forgiveness, what it meant, whether it was even relevant. She'd long since stopped blaming him for the trajectory her life took, had accepted that his choices gave her opportunity to become something she couldn't have been otherwise. That empress who rebuilt empire had been forged in betrayal and crisis. I don't think forgiveness matters, she said finally. What matters is understanding. You did what your nature demanded, chose validation over partnership, nearly destroyed everything pursuing what you thought you needed. I responded by becoming ruthless enough to survive and build from wreckage. We're both consequences of our choices. Forgiveness doesn't change that, Ange. But I don't hate you, she added. Realized it was true. I'm not sure I feel much toward you except tired recognition that we're both flawed people who tried and failed and tried again. Who built empire despite ourselves. Who learned lessons too late to fix what we broke, but in time to build something new. That's more than I deserve. Darius's voice carried weight. Regret, maybe. Acceptance, certainly. I destroyed what we had, nearly destroyed the empire, and you saved it by becoming something I forced you to become. That debt doesn't clear. No, Serafina agreed. It doesn't. But debts aren't always meant to be cleared. Sometimes they're just meant to be carried. Reminder of what was lost, what was learned, what has to be remembered to prevent repetition. They stood together among the graves, former partners, former enemies, now just two people who'd survived each other and were trying to make sense of aftermath. The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either, just existed. Acknowledgement of shared history and separate futures. Eventually Darius spoke again, quieter, almost vulnerable. Do you ever wonder if it was worth it? All the cost, all the transformation, all the terrible things we both did. Does the empire we built justify the price? Every day, Serafina admitted. And I don't have answer. Some days I think yes, that stability and prosperity and systems that protect millions justify individual sacrifices. Other days I think we just told ourselves that to avoid facing what we'd become. That we justified evil as necessity because admitting we enjoyed the power would have been too honest. Which is right. Both probably. Neither. Serafina looked at the graves surrounding them. Truth isn't simple. We're not simple. We're people who did good and evil, built and destroyed, saved and killed. And history will argue about whether we were heroes or villains for centuries while missing that we were just humans making impossible choices and living with consequences. Darius nodded, extended his hand one final time. Not for partnership, not for forgiveness, just for acknowledgement. Recognition between two people who'd shaped each other through conflict and survival and mutual transformation. Serafina took it, shook once, felt the weight of their shared history, all the versions of themselves they'd been, and lost and become. The love that had died, the partnership that had broken, the empire that had survived despite them. Then they separated, walked different directions, back to separate territories and separate lives, carrying their own weights, their own legacies, their own understanding of what they'd built and what it cost. Serafina returned to her chambers, former empress quarters that felt strange now, empty. She'd spent so long being monarch that stepping away left void she didn't know how to fill. But she'd learn, would find purpose beyond ruling, beyond constant crisis and desperate survival. Elena arrived with wine and the comfortable silence of long partnership. They sat together without speaking. No words needed, just presence. Acknowledgement that they'd survived, that empire continued, that their work, however flawed, had created foundation for something potentially better. "What will you do now?" Elena asked eventually. "You've got years left, energy, experience. Can't imagine you'll just fade into quiet retirement. Teach, maybe." Serafina considered. Train the next generation of administrators. Write histories that acknowledge complexity instead of painting simple narratives. Try to pass on lessons learned through blood and fire so others don't have to learn them the same way. That's optimistic. Elena's voice carried skepticism. Thinking people learn from history, that they won't make the same mistakes in different forms. Probably. Serafina smiled. But trying is better than cynicism, and I've done enough cynical, brutal pragmatism to last lifetime. Time to try something else. See if wisdom purchased through transformation can benefit people who come after. She looked out her window at the capital, at empires she'd saved through becoming things she'd never intended to be, at systems she'd built that might, possibly, prevent future rulers from following her path, at legacy that was neither purely good nor purely evil, but complicated mixture of both. And she understood finally what it all meant. The betrayal, the transformation, the choices that had carved away pieces of herself until someone harder remained. It wasn't tragedy, wasn't triumph, just evolution. The price of survival when surviving meant everything. She'd been queen who tried to build through partnership. That woman had died in corridor when allies tried to kill her. What emerged was empress willing to do whatever necessary to preserve empire. That woman had executed and burned and broken until threats were eliminated. And now that woman was stepping aside for someone who could build on foundation purchased through blood. 3 versions of herself. 3 stages of transformation, each necessary, each costly, each real. And the empire endured. Flawed, functional, forever carrying scars of what it took to build it, forever influenced by women who'd become monster to save it, forever trying to prove that cycles could break, that transformation could lead somewhere other than corruption, that hard choices made in crisis could result in better world afterward. Whether it worked remained to be seen. Whether history judged her kindly didn't matter. She'd done what she could, survived what should have killed her, built what could be built from wreckage, and left it to next generation to continue or destroy according to their own choices. That was enough. Had to be enough. Because she'd given everything else. Had nothing left except understanding that power's real cost wasn't the enemies you destroyed. It was the person you had to become to wield it, and living with that person afterward, accepting what you'd become while trying to ensure it served purpose beyond just surviving. Serafina stood, stretched, felt years of weight settling into bones, smiled despite it all, despite the cost, despite the bodies, despite everything she'd lost and gained and transformed into. She'd survived. Empire survived. And tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that breaking cycles was possible, that transformation didn't have to mean corruption, that the woman forged in betrayal and fire could still build something worth leaving behind. That would have to be enough.